Welcome back to a new love for the Jamestown Brides series by best-selling historical romance author Indiana Wake. In her real wedding day, love is within reach, but the path to the altar is anything but certain. As past wounds, hidden fears, and unexpected trials arise, one woman must decide if she is brave enough to trust the promise of a future she never believed could be hers. In a colony where survival is never guaranteed and happiness must be fought for, her wedding day will become more than a ceremony. It will be a testament to faith, resilience, and a love strong enough to endure every test. Settle in for a heartfelt story of second chances, courage, and the journey toward the wedding day that truly matters. Copyright Indiana Wake. Her Real Wedding Day by Indiana Wake. Chapter 1. Julia Darnley had never felt more uncomfortable in her life. For one thing, she had never been left alone with a man in the drawing room of her father's fine house before. For another, she didn't like the way Bartholomew Exeter was looking at her. She knew undisguised lust when she saw it. Julia was a romantic young woman, one who had dreamed of eliciting such a response from a man and the inevitable devotion it would bring. But she had never imagined that man would be old enough to be her father. The story of her life, the one she had told herself since she was a girl, was now going horribly wrong. Julia knew that her hopes and dreams were like those of so many other young gentlewomen, a handsome man who would love her as much as she loved him and the happiest of lives. Still, her dream was unique to her. A tale that had grown in detail over many years of silent telling until she could clearly see the home she would share with the handsome man and every one of her 4 children, right down to the color of their eyes. Now, however, Bartholomew Exeter was trampling all over her dream, casting her beautiful imaginary children aside in his wake. He hadn't proposed to her yet, but she knew deep down in her bones that he was about to. It was the only explanation for her father's sudden and awkwardly executed absence from the room. "You look nice today, Miss Darnley," he began after some moments of silence. "That bodice is very becoming." Once again, he studied her with such intensity that she felt uncomfortable. Had she known what this day would bring, Julia would have worn her very plainest and ill-fitting bodice and skirt. She would even have made little effort with her thick, straw-colored hair. "Thank you, Mr. Exeter," she said, and was irritated to see how pleased he was that she was blushing. No doubt he thought her simply coquettish, a young woman full of excitement at the prospect of marrying such a wealthy and well-connected man. Well, this young woman was not at all excited, for the man was not only far too old for her, he was distinctly unappealing in not only his appearance, but his manner. He could never, ever, have fitted into Julia's dream of a life. "I suppose you have a good idea of why your father has wandered away and left you alone with me, my dear," he said, and rose from his seat in the armchair opposite and crossed the room. When he sat down on the couch beside her, Julia felt suddenly trapped. This man was so convinced of his success that he was already behaving in a most inappropriate manner. Of course, Julia knew exactly why a man would be so convinced of his success before the lady before him had uttered her response. Her father had already told him he could have her, and that was all there was to it. "I do, and I would like to ask you now to say nothing, Mr. Exeter. I do not want to be in the position of having to reject you, sir. Truly, I do not want to hurt your feelings." Julia was surprised to hear a certain firmness of tone in her own voice when the fact was that she felt nauseous and afraid. "I beg your pardon." Bartholomew Exeter could not have looked more shocked if Julia had slapped him about the face. Now it was his turn to have a little color rising in his cheeks, although Julia very much doubted it was embarrassment. The narrowing of his beady dark eyes suggested anger, and she was certain that was the cause for his sudden high coloring. "I am simply trying to put you off before you begin, Mr. Exeter. I already feel greatly uncomfortable and do not want to feel more so by being forced to decline whatever offer you are about to make." As I said before, I would not want to hurt your feelings. My feelings? Bartholomew Exeter snorted with derisory laughter. My feelings do not come into it, child. And let's be honest, my dear, your feelings do not come into it either. What do you mean? Julia asked, playing ignorant when she was anything but. Do you really think you are in any position to reject me, Miss Darnley? He had already regained his equilibrium and had turned so easily from charm to sarcasm that Julia wondered which of the two behaviors described the man better. I have the right to say no, sir, Julia said, answering the question without actually answering the question. Who else do you think is going to make an approach to you now, Miss Darnley, since your father has lost his fortune and cannot provide a decent dowry for you? I would have thought that you would realize your options are few. You do not want to be left in the position of having to accept a poor man who will take you for a mere £10. The way he laughed made Julia feel very small, humiliated. He was taunting her with her father's financial ruin as if it was something that she herself thought to be ashamed of. She did, of course, feel a little ashamed, but only because that was how England worked. A person could be the toast of the town one moment and a pariah the next, and if it was not an indiscretion which brought the thing about, it was most commonly a lack of money. I would rather accept a poor man I loved than a rich man I did not, Julia said defiantly, sliding back across the couch until she was pressed hard up against the arm. You need not act so dainty with me, I am not about to lunge for you, he said in a ridiculously offended manner. Forgive me, your careful scrutiny of my appearance from head to toe has made me rather uncomfortable. Now that you seek to bully and cajole me into accepting an offer of marriage, I feel more uncomfortable still. In fact, I must leave. Forgive me, I cannot stay alone in this room with you. She was already on her feet and striding with purpose towards the door. You would marry a poor man for love? Bartholomew was on his feet with surprising speed given his age and reached her just in time to stretch out an arm and lay his palm flat against the door, preventing her from leaving. That is a very silly notion, Miss Darnley. When young ladies like you declare such things, they imagine a future where they are still wearing fine clothes in a nice clean home. You do not know what a poor man looks like, what he smells like. Perhaps I ought to withdraw my offer and let you find that out for yourself, you saucy little chit. His anger was more apparent than before. Please let me leave, Mr. Exeter, Julia said, knowing that she had 100 arguments and choosing not to speak even one of them aloud, there would be no point. She had been promised to the man who was now glaring at her as if he despised her very bones, and she had a terrible feeling that there was very little she could do about it. You will marry me, Julia Darnley. His tone was low and dangerous. Your father will see to that. You may say no all you wish, but it will not help you now. No, Mr. Exeter. No, 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 she said and stood her ground, glaring at him with equal anger. I do not accept your proposal, I will not marry you. I will give you some time to think about it, for it is much better to walk up the aisle of your own accord rather than as a pressed woman, he smirked. Do not look so high and mighty, it is of little matter to me whether you want to marry me or not. I do not care either way, for I will have you in the end and that, my dear, is the material point. I will win and you will lose. And you will continue to lose for the rest of your life, I will see to that. You will regret your haughty behavior towards me the day when you are my wife, when you are my property. I will never be your property, Julia said and roughly pushed his arm away, tearing at the door handle. But when she finally had the door open, it was to find herself staring at none other than her father, and her father looked every bit as angry with her as Bartholomew Exeter did. Chapter 2. We have been at this for 2 days, Julia, and still you are not listening to me. Bernard Darnley let out a hiss of exasperation. How many more times must I tell you that our choices are very limited? Our choices? Don't you mean my options, father? Julia said, and not for the first time. I cannot provide a dowry for you, and so I must find you a good match with a man who does not expect one. There are very few men who have not only the money to suffer such poor terms, but also the inclination to do so. Bartholomew Exeter is a very fine man, and I have no doubt that he will keep you very well. You'll want for nothing, my dear. Except, perhaps, for love, Julia said, and ignored her father's sarcastic laughter. And I very much doubt that Mr. Exeter is going to treat me well now. You were on the other side of the door, father. You must have heard how he threatened me. Nothing more than the heat of the moment, my dear, her father said in a booming and cajoling voice. You are willing to take such a risk, are you? Julia said, and stared at him. But of course, you are not, father. You are not taking a risk with anything important like your own life. You are taking a risk with mine. You behave as if I owe you something, Julia. But after giving you a good and privileged upbringing and a modicum of education, it is time that you realize that it is you who is in debt, not me. When a man fathers a child, it is understood that he will provide for them. You talk as if that is a favor when it is a simple responsibility. Had I known that the price would be so high, I would have wished never to have been born at all. Now you are just being childish. Why not? You are treating me like a child. You are talking to me as if I were a child. Julia could feel tears stinging her eyes, but she absolutely refused to let them fall. Instead, she turned away from her father and stared wide-eyed at the fireplace in the drawing room, not daring to blink until the threat of tears had passed. You will marry him, Julia, her father said in a firm but somewhat resigned tone. I am sorry that you are not happy about it, but there is very little I can do. There is, Julia said, knowing that there was no point but unable to stop trying. You could wait, you could give me time. Time for what? Time to find a man I truly love, father, Julia said hopefully. And what man, whether he loves you or not, would be in a position to take you without a dowry? Who would be prepared to? Not all men are so concerned with money. For goodness sake, you are not going to tell me that you would sooner marry a poor man for love than a rich man for nothing more than a comfortable life? As you rightly pointed out, I heard it all through the door, and I am no more impressed by it than Bartholomew Exeter was. I do not need you to be impressed by it, father. I just need you to recognize it as the truth, for it is. There is nothing more important to me in this world than love, and I cannot have my hopes and dreams crushed beneath your feet for no better reason than you could not wait a few weeks or months for me to find a husband for myself and be gone from your household. It is not simply that I am trying to find you a good home so that I do not have to pay for your upkeep anymore, not at all. It is a consideration, obviously, but not my main one. Then you have some other purpose you expect me to fulfill? Some other problem that is to be solved for you by throwing away my life? You will mind what you say, Julia. I am still your father, and this is still my house. What purpose? Julia said, determined to make no apology whatsoever. Bartholomew Exeter is a very well-connected man. I still have a little money left, although it is nothing compared to what I once possessed. But with the right opportunities, with certain backing, I could grow what little I have until it becomes the fortune I once enjoyed. So, you see, there is much more to a marriage than the simple transfer of a daughter's upkeep from her father to her husband. Oh, I see, Julia said sarcastically, an attitude which was almost entirely alien to her. I am not merely an encumbrance but a stepping stone to ensure a better future for yourself. Yes, that is right, I am a stepping stone. I am to suffer in hopes that you never do. My heart is not in it. I am not sure how much I care if you are to suffer, Father. I will make you care. I have told you already you will not speak to me in such a fashion under my own roof. Then perhaps I ought not to be under your roof any more, sir, Julia said, and rose from the couch, folding her arms across her chest and glaring at him. Perhaps that is the solution for us both. And where is it you think that you will go? Believe me, there is nowhere but the gutter. If you are so keen to avoid suffering, then I think I am quite confident that you would never do such a thing to yourself. Then you do not know me at all, Father, for I cannot marry Bartholomew Exeter. Even if you drag me by my hair up the aisle, I will scream in the minister's face and tell him how I have been forced. No man of God would make me marry under such circumstances. And no man of good sense would marry you after such a display when news of it travels far and wide. Bernard Darnley did not even bother to get up from his armchair, but simply sat looking at her as if he were growing bored with the circuitous conversation. You will not listen to me at all, will you? You will not think about this, truly think about it, for long enough to understand how it is I feel. But you are a man, aren't you? Why would you care what a woman feels? Even if she is your own daughter, why would you give a second thought to the powerlessness she feels? To how trapped she feels, caged by her sex and her own father. Why would you care when you were born with the greater advantage? I think you know that this sort of talk will not find you a husband anywhere, not even a poor man. Now, I have heard enough from you and I will not listen to any more, Julia. Finally, her father rose to his feet, stretching and yawning in a way which made Julia despise him. Was she really worth so little that her pleas would have no greater effect on her father than to make him yawn? Make him bored? I will not marry Bartholomew Exeter, Julia said simply, wanting her father to know that she objected now and forever. Oh yes, you will, Julia. You will marry him. And with that, her father walked from the room, not looking back once at his only daughter. Chapter 3. Are you absolutely certain, Edward? Julia asked, feeling sick to her stomach. It is well known throughout Kensington that Bartholomew Exeter used to beat his last wife dreadfully, Edward said, and looked down awkwardly at the floor. There are those who say that it was a blessing that the poor woman succumbed to tuberculosis when she did. Edward, is that to be my plight? Am I to be bullied and beaten for the rest of my life until I reach the point where death is a mercy? And all for what? To give our father a chance to continue to live in the manner to which he has become accustomed? He would put his own excessive comfort above my very life? Julia, I did not mean to upset you with all of this, but I think that the situation is very grave. I would take it all to father, but I'm certain that he knows it already. I do not want to show my cards prematurely, you see. Edward was perched on the end of Julia's bed. He had not been a regular visitor to her chamber since they were children, his attendance at Eton and then Oxford putting an end to the old closeness they had once enjoyed. Even now, however, they still cared about one another, and Julia found herself a little overwhelmed to discover just how much the idea of her being married away to an unsuitable man upset Edward. At least there was somebody in the family who still cared for her. How she wished that her mother had still been alive, even though she knew that it would have done her no good. Her long since departed mother would have been no match for her father, and to see her capitulate would have broken Julia's heart. No, it was better that her mother was not there to see it all unfold. It was bad enough that Edward was suffering. Show your cards. What do you mean, Edward? Julia whispered as she stared at her brother's young and handsome face by the flickering candlelight. He had crept into her room long after midnight, knowing that their father would be in a deep and brandy-fueled sleep that would now remain uninterrupted until at least 10 o'clock the following morning. If I show father that I object to your marrying Bartholomew Exeter, he might very well suspect me of trying to help you. And if he does, then helping you will become very difficult indeed. I think that your safety is the most important thing. He really is as bad as all that? As I understand it, Bartholomew Exeter is a pig, Edward said angrily, uttering his words a little loudly for her comfort. Then I am lost and there is no help that you can give me, Julia said as, finally, her tears fell. She had held them in for so long that once they truly began, it was a perverse sort of relief. Father will make me marry him, I know he will. Not if you are not here to marry him, Julia. Not if you are away from here, from London. Away from London? But where am I to go? We have no other family outside of London, we do not know anybody out in the counties. If I am to walk away from this house with nothing, I might as well do so in the town of my birth. If I am to be poor and destitute, then let me be poor and destitute in London. I have a plan, Julia, and it does not involve you being either poor or destitute. But you will need to leave London, there is nothing else for it. But where am I to go? What is your plan? I would tell it to you, but you must hear me out from beginning to end. No interrupting, Julia, I mean it, he said and sounded more serious than she had ever heard him. All right, I will hear you out, Julia said, not even convinced she would not interrupt at some point. When I say you must leave London, what I really mean is that you must leave England. Leave England? Julia said in a high-pitched squeal. Julia, you must be quiet. I know he is in a deep sleep, but we cannot risk him coming in here, Edward said with his hands out in front of him, palms facing forward. And you did say you would hear me out. I knew I would not get beyond the first sentence, he said and smiled at her, reminding her of the boy he had once been. I'm sorry, Edward. I did not mean to shout, but I was so shocked, so thoroughly taken aback. Where do you mean to send me? I do not mean to send you anywhere. If you go, you must go of your own accord. I am not the man who would force you to do anything, sister. I am not our father, as you very well know. I am sorry, really I am. You need not be sorry, just listen, Edward said and raised his eyebrows at her in the gloom. I have learned a little about an opportunity for English women to emigrate to America. America? Julia said, but this time in a whisper. Yes, to Jamestown in Virginia. It could be to anywhere in America, Edward, and still I would have no idea. It is hardly worth telling me the name of the town. I believe it is more a colony than a town, as such. He shrugged. But at least let me tell you what I know of it. Yes, very well. Tell me all about Jamestown in Virginia, Julia said, already feeling that her tiny flash of optimism had been well and truly extinguished. In many ways, she wished that her brother had never come to her room at all, for he had given her hope, and it was hope that did not exist. All she could do now was bask in the glow of his caring, the idea that he would help her if he could. That was as much as she was going to get out of Edward's efforts, however much she wanted to hold on to something. Well, as I said, Jamestown is an English colony and has been growing slowly over the last 20 years or so. You will have heard of the Virginia Company, I suppose? Yes, of course I have. For goodness sake, Edward, I know what tobacco is. Well, a great deal of it comes from Virginia because it is grown there. So many fine Englishmen have made their way out there over the last 20 years to become planters. A great many more have followed, just the sort of men who are needed to create a society, farmers, preachers, men of law, men of trade. I see, Julia said and shook her head to indicate that she really did not see at all. Some of them took wives, of course, being already married. But a clear majority were young men, not yet married, all determined to concentrate on the new opportunity presented to them. Yes, but how does that affect me? The Virginia Company have been looking for well-bred women to go out to the New World as wives for the men who went out there alone. There is a great shortage of women, I believe. You would send me off to a man in America whom I have never met? It is not quite like that, Julia. The thing is, women are in such great demand that I believe they have a very vast choice. And not only do they have a vast choice, they have the right to say no. Edward said the last with a certain significance. If a man proposes marriage and she does not want him, the woman may reject him and wait until a more appropriate suitor appears. And what if that suitor never appears? Who does she marry then? Nobody if she does not want to. And the Virginia Company have made it very clear that the women will be treated well, looked after. You will be housed out there. I have heard it myself from a man who works for the Virginia Company. That sounds incredibly lonely. I do not think you will be lonely, Julia. I think you will have men lining up and dropping to their knees for the opportunity to marry you. Oh, I don't mean me. I mean the men who have been going out there year after year and making their lives in America. To have lived there for so long without a wife must be incredibly lonely, Julia said a little wistfully as Edward smiled. I have missed you these last few days, Julia. Missed me? But I have been here all the time. What I mean is that I have missed your romantic heart. I can see it in your face. You are already imagining some fine young man, a hero who is all alone in the world and in desperate need of a woman to love. But not just any woman, for this man, this hero, could only ever marry Julia Darnley, Edward said and began to chuckle. I would pinch you, Edward, but it appears you know me too well. Yes, I was already thinking that the very man I am supposed to marry is, as we speak, thousands of miles away. So, you will consider it? Yes, I will consider it very carefully. The thing is, you do not have long to decide, Edward said and looked a little rueful. I do not think father can arrange my marriage to Bartholomew Exeter at the drop of a hat. No, that's not what I mean. There is a ship leaving for America, you see. Edward winced. And it leaves next week, although I do not know exactly what day. It is the Good Ship Warwick, and it is set to leave Gravesend for America carrying all the ordinary sorts of supplies and, I believe, a good number of maids all bound for a better life and a choice of husband. Next week? Oh, Edward, that is an awful lot to think about, Julia said and suddenly her heart began to pound. I must decide in the blink of an eye whether to make some approach to the Virginia Company and agree to leave England, bound for America, destined never to return. I hate to say so, but you have put it very clearly. In essence, that is exactly the choice you must make. But think of it like this, sister. You are not choosing whether or not to live in one country or the other. You are choosing whether or not you might have the opportunity to find the love that seems to have always been so important to you. If you stay here, you will never have that opportunity. I can guarantee you that. Yes, I know, Julia said sadly. It will pain me to release you and know that I will never see you again, Julia. You are my only sister and you could not be dearer to me than you are, believe me. But I do believe that the pain of losing you will be nothing in comparison to the pain of seeing you married to one of the most brutish men in all of London. That is the choice I had to make before coming in here to tell you about it. I think I must go, Edward. But you can write to me, can't you? I can write to you? Of course, we can write, Julia. You are going to become a part of the new world, not a prisoner in it. Then I really do think I must. If the ship sails next week, I do not have time to think about it, do I? Not really, Edward said and finally reached out to take her hand. But I will help you every step of the way. I will take a few of your possessions every day to a little inn at Gravesend so that father will be none the wiser. By the time you are ready to leave, everything you will need to take with you will already be in Gravesend and ready to be stowed away on the ship. Thank you, Edward. I cannot bear to think of leaving you, but I cannot bear to think of staying either. I will never forgive our father for driving us apart like this. Forget about him, forget about father. Climb up on board that ship and sail off into a new life, a brighter future. And never look back, my dear, just keep moving forward, always forward. And finally, Edward took his crying sister into his arms. Chapter 4. In the end, Julia Darnley had even less than a week to make her mind up and get to Gravesend. The official from the Virginia Company had been very pleased with her scant list of skills and her brother's evidence that she was a gentlewoman who could claim Sir Gordon Landry, a baronet, as a second cousin twice removed. But the official had declared that she would need to be in Gravesend for some days before the Good Ship Warwick set sail, for he could not be entirely sure that it would not leave a day or two early. It would leave whenever the captain deemed it suitable, and they most certainly would not wait for her to make her way there. Edward had seen to it that as many of her belongings as possible found their way in secret to the little inn at Gravesend. Quite how he had managed it, she did not dare ask. All that mattered to Julia was that her father was not at all aware of it and that Edward would not suffer at their father's hands for helping her to escape. With that in mind, when the time came for her to leave her home for the last time in the early hours of the morning, it was alone. Edward had, at first, insisted on going with her, but Julia had firmly declined. As much as she had wanted him at her side, she could not risk her father finding out how Edward had helped her nor eliciting from him where she had gone to. All that she ever wanted her father to know was that she had left, she had quitted his roof just as she said she would. Julia did not want him to know that she had gone to America, even though she was certain that he would not bother to try and retrieve her. But America, or Jamestown at least, was made up of Englishmen and so, she assumed, it would simply be a smaller version of England itself. If that were the case, perhaps nothing more than a letter from her father or even from Sir Gordon Landry, the relative who secured her position as a gentlewoman, might be enough to see the authorities in Virginia put her on the very next ship back. No, she could not have risked it. As she wandered through the tatty streets which lined the banks of the River Thames at Gravesend, Julia looked all about her. It was not yet fully light and everywhere looked grey, even the water. It all seemed so dirty. But in that moment, Julia knew that she would miss London with all her heart. She could not concentrate on how she would miss Edward and the few friends she still had after her father's financial ruin. It was just too hard. And so, if she must feel sad, it would be for London. That vibrant, dirty, wealthy, impoverished city that teemed with life before the sun was even up in the sky. She tried to imagine America and wondered if it was anything at all like London. Not all of America, of course, just Jamestown. She had heard of Jamestown over the years, little snippets of conversation of the new colony and the adventurous men who had gone out there to claim it. The truth was, that was as much as she knew. Julia knew nothing of the climate, the standard of living, the everyday life in Jamestown itself. She was truly stepping into the unknown. Finally reaching her destination, Julia stood in the cold, early autumn air and peered up to the very rafters of the coaching inn that was to be her home from now until the Good Ship Warwick sailed. At least it was a good place, a respectable-looking place. Julia knew that if she had been forced to start this new life of hers in some rat-infested hole in a back street of Gravesend, she would likely have lost her nerve altogether and run home to her father and the awful prospect of a miserable life as Mrs. Bartholomew Exeter. Of all the streets she had walked through, this one was curiously deserted. There was no sound or sign of anybody, although she could see a light glowing through the small windows of the inn. She had no doubt that if she knocked now on that heavy wooden door, she would be allowed admittance immediately. Julia did not want to knock just yet. She wanted a moment to herself, truly to herself, a moment in which to say goodbye to her old life and to the woman she had once been. She wanted to say goodbye to her old dream of a handsome husband and a fine home in England, for that was a dream which no longer existed. It would never come to pass. Julia felt desolate as she stood there, a woman alone on a deserted riverside street with nobody to see her off, nobody to wish her well. More importantly, there was nobody to shed a tear for the loss of Miss Julia Darnley, and she had never felt more alone in her life. "Can I help you, miss?" Julia had been so caught up in her own thoughts that she had not heard the creak as the wooden door had opened inward. A woman of her own age was peering out at her, smiling warmly, her eyebrows raised in question. There was something in that woman's eyes, however, which spoke of a recognition. Julia had never met her before, so she was certain that she couldn't be right. "Forgive me, I was about to knock," Julia said in a near whisper, as if to speak any louder would wake the entire street. "I am one of the maids bound for Virginia." She spoke more quietly still, as if her very words held shame. "So am I, my dear." The woman, smiling more broadly still, stepped out of the doorway and into the street. "My name is Constance. Constance Dearborn." "It is nice to meet you, Miss Dearborn." "My name is Julia Darnley." "You look just as I felt yesterday, Miss Darnley," Constance said, and Julia realized where that flash of recognition had come from. She did not recognize Julia, she had recognized her silent fear and misgivings. "And if I am honest, I did not sleep well last night, which is why I am up and about so early this morning." "And how do you feel now?" Julia asked, keen to know that the fear would soon leave her. "Very much better." Constance Dearborn nodded vigorously. "We have very nice rooms here at the inn, and the officials from the Virginia Company are seeing to it that we are kept very well. It gives me a little hope that there is some truth to it all, that we really will be valued when we finally reach our destination." "Then let us hope you sleep a little better tonight," Julia said, knowing that she herself would not sleep a wink. "Are you ready to come inside? There is some tea and pound cake if you are hungry." "Yes, thank you," Julia said, and turned to look all about her as if she would never see the world outside the door of the inn again. "I know, Miss Darnley." "I know," Constance said gently as she reached out and took Julia's hand. Chapter 5. The arduous journey of so many weeks at sea took something of a toll on Julia. She had chewed so much ginger root given to her by Anne Wallace, one of her dear companions, that her tongue had raised ridges on it and was very sore. Of course, Julia knew that there were others who had suffered greater maladies, and she was grateful to have been blighted by no more than seasickness and extraordinarily poor living conditions. But it was not the physical deprivations which had brought Julia low, rather it was the sea itself. It had taken her some days to admit to her 5 traveling companions that she was so afraid to look out across the water, even on a calm day. Diane Walton and Caroline Lawton, both rather self-possessed and a little cynical, had said nothing at all when Julia had told them that she preferred to stay below decks and pretend to herself that she was still on dry land. There was nothing unkind in their silence, but Julia could readily see that neither of those 2 very capable women could understand such a notion as pretense. They had suffered their fair share of seasickness, and both had found a measure of relief in the fresh air that was to be found on the upper deck. And Wallace, the apothecary, had been so busy tending to them all that she had hardly time to listen to Julia's unusual revelation, and had, instead, handed her another small piece of ginger root. Grace Bates had been as understanding as she could possibly be, and Julia had been touched that a young woman of just 16 years would try so hard to put herself in somebody else's shoes. But of them all, it was Constance who had truly listened, and it was to Constance to whom Julia had told it all in the end. "I was perfectly all right when we were sailing along the Thames, Connie. I was still all right when we came out of the estuary and onto the open water, for I could still see England behind me. But it is now, right now, when we are in the middle of nowhere, that I cannot stand it. There is nothing to look at but the sea, no land in sight, nothing. I know it sounds ridiculous to say it is so vast, but it is. Yes, I suffer a little fear myself at times. If I did not feel so dreadfully sick all the time, I might not be so keen to look out upon the water either. I do worry what will become of us if something happens to the ship, for, as you say, there is no land in sight, not even a little island for us to cling to. I do worry about that, but I'm not sure it is entirely that which upsets me," Julia said tentatively. "It's all right, Julia, we're friends. You may tell me anything," Constance had whispered as the two of them sat side by side on the little mattress they shared between decks. "I think it's because, whenever I look at the sea, I suffer the dreadful notion that I am nowhere. I keep imagining that there is nothing now but sea, that awful blue-gray water, the little crests of white. I start to think to myself, what if there is nothing else? Then I start to panic, and I feel my heart beating so fast it is almost painful." Julia could feel her cheeks reddening with embarrassment. "When water is all you can see from where you are to the horizon, it is a perfectly sensible thing to think," Constance said kindly. "I believe you are much more of a thinker than anybody else would give you credit for. I think it's understandable to have such imaginings. The important thing, my dear, is to try to replace such an upsetting imagining with one which is much nicer. Like seeing land suddenly come into view?" Julia said hopefully. "Perhaps not land, for it is some weeks off yet, and I worry that you will soon grow bored of imagining something that is so far away. No, I'm thinking more of taking your mind off it altogether. Every time you think about the sea and how it stretches out in every direction, close your eyes and imagine your future husband." Constance was smiling brightly, and Julia could not help but laugh. "You have got the measure of me already, haven't you? I know you have a romantic soul, Julia. Nobody in our little party could doubt that for a moment. Do you think me very silly, Connie?" "I don't think you silly at all, not for a moment. I have held on to a romantic notion or two myself over the years, and I remember well how good it feels. I also know the need to usurp fears wherever we can, for there are already enough to be dealt with. Then I am going to imagine my wonderfully handsome husband," Julia said, already in the spirit of things. "He is very tall, Connie." She began her new dream of a life as her friends smiled indulgently. "And he's broad-shouldered, for I should not like to be married to a narrow-shouldered man." "Oh yes, and he has dark hair." "His hair is as dark as mine is fair, and I am very proud of him as we walk arm in arm through the fine streets of Jamestown." Julia stopped when Constance laughed. "You do not think I will find my handsome husband?" "I do not think the streets of Jamestown will be fine," Constance clarified. "But I have no doubt at all that your fine and handsome husband will be waiting for you by the water's edge even as we speak." "Oh, you are kind," Julia said, and turned on the mattress to throw her arms around Constance's neck. Julia had found the instant intimacy of the little group both refreshing and surprising. She had been raised in a very staid household where she was constantly reminded that she was a gentlewoman and a relative of baronet. Such displays of emotion would have been utterly frowned upon by her father, that was for certain. But she was not in her father's house anymore, and it was entirely by his doing. Julia knew that she no longer owed him her manners or her way of being. She owned that now, it was hers to do with as she wished. She was in the middle of that dreadful sea because her father had not listened, had not cared, and if she chose to make friends with women, some of whom her father would only ever have employed as household servants, she would do just that. For the rest of the voyage, Julia had concentrated every day on her new dream, the one which had fully replaced the old dream. She could hardly remember now the contents of the dreams of home and handsome suitors that had filled her head for so many years previous. All she could think of now was her new dream and, in the end, she knew she must. Julia was doing what her brother had suggested. She was moving only forward and never looking back. Her old dreams of a life were just that, old. They were no longer hers, they no longer existed, and they were no longer possible. All that was possible now was the future, whatever it held, and so Julia would picture it in her mind and feel it with all her heart. Surely, that was the only way to have any hope of it all coming true. When they finally arrived at the Jamestown wharf on a cold winter's day, Julia was already feeling better. As her companions dissolved into fears of the unknown, the very unknown that was now upon them, Julia found herself feeling excited instead. The truth was that she had felt a good deal better ever since they had first spotted land. It had centered her again and made her feel that the world truly existed after all. She had not been set adrift forever on the unstable gray-blue of the cruel sea. "I just hope that at least one man is interested in me, and pray he is a good man," Constance said under her breath and almost to herself as the two of them stood side by side on the upper deck looking across the river and down towards the wharf. "You must have a good man, Connie. You deserve nothing but the very best, my dear," Julia said and truly meant it. As the two women stood surreptitiously holding hands, their four closest friends gathering around them, Julia could feel her heartbeat quicken. There were so many men standing on the wharf and silently peering at them. And so many of them were young, certainly no more than 30 years, and Julia began to realize that it really was true. The women really did have the choosing. "There are so many of them," Constance said and sounded a little daunted. "It is wonderful, isn't it?" Julia said, and could not be daunted if she set her heart on it. She felt alive with possibility and there was nothing she could do to tamp it down. "Oh, Connie, I wonder if my handsome husband is down there somewhere." "Oh, I do hope so, my sweet girl," Constance said and finally relaxed into a broad smile. "Imagine that, the man that I will love, the one who will love me for the rest of my life, out there now and amongst that sea of faces. I wonder if he is looking at me even as we speak. What would I do without you, Julia?" Constance squeezed her hand firmly. "Whenever I have doubts, you seem to show me the way with your brightness. How glad I am that I opened the door at the inn at Gravesend that day to find you standing there. Whatever happens, Connie, promise me that we will always be friends." "There is no man on earth who could part us, my dear," Connie said, and the two women embraced. And there they stood, a group of 6 women, just 6 among many, all of them afraid and excited by turns as they waited for the little rowboats that would take them ashore to their new lives. Chapter 6. The first few days in Jamestown seemed to rush by in a haze of excitement for Julia. It had begun on the Good Ship Warwick as she peered down at the crowd gathered below and had not been dulled as she had stood on the run-down wharf trying to concentrate on the words of Sir Francis Wyatt, the new governor who had welcomed them to America. If her life depended on it, she could not have remembered a single word the man had spoken, although his words had given some measure of comfort to her companions, that much she knew. And then there was John Watterson, that dear man from the Virginia Company who did his very best to keep them all calm and happy whilst he explained where each and every one of them would be billeted whilst they waited for the perfect marriage to come their way. Again, Julia had only listened to bits and pieces, her attention otherwise drawn this way and that, finally landing on the face of one of the most handsome men she had ever seen in her life. He was tall and broad, just as her little dream of a life had dictated. But more than that, he was as dark as she was fair, and she was certain, even though he was some feet from her, that he had blue eyes. Already he was perfect, and he had not spoken a word. He was well dressed, perhaps even a little better dressed than most of the men who stood on the wharf that day. He wore dark breeches and knee boots with a long pale green waistcoat and white shirt beneath a long black frock coat. He held a tricorn hat under his arm, and she was glad of it, for she would not have seen his thick, wavy dark hair as well as she could if he had the thing on his head. Best of all, the handsome man was looking right back at her, studying her as much as she was studying him. When she realized that they were looking into one another's eyes, albeit they were separated by some distance, Julia remembered her manners. Whilst she had partially dispensed with her upbringing on board the Warwick, she had not tossed it aside altogether insofar as she had, at least, the decency to blush. Feeling her cheeks redden, she smiled at him shyly and was rewarded with a simple nod from the man before he turned to look in another direction altogether. Julia did not know whether to be disappointed or not. Had he seen enough, or was he simply too much of a gentleman to continue to stare at a young lady he had not yet been introduced to? In Julia's customary fashion, she chose to believe the latter. There was something about arriving in America which had somehow brought her back to her old self, the woman she had been before that awful day in the drawing-room when Bartholomew Exeter had made his clumsy proposal. She was once again the woman of dreams and hopes, one who was certain that romance still existed in the world and that hers was simply waiting around the corner. As much as she missed her dear brother, Julia knew that she had made the right decision. Whatever came next, she would have a say in it. This was freedom to her, the idea that she might choose her own husband. In the end, Julia thought that it was surely a fundamental right, and she was glad that she had escaped England in search of it. She would be further glad to discover that she had found the right man in her first moments. "Are you in a little world of your own again, Julia?" Ursula Grant, the housekeeper at Meryton's Hundred where Julia and Constance were billeted, came into the sitting room with a tray containing a teapot, 2 cups, and 2 saucers. "I am always in a little world of my own, Ursula. I do hope you can forgive me, I dream more than I am awake." Julia smiled broadly. "But I am wondering how my dear Connie is getting on. I do hope she likes Jack Thornton's farm, he seems like such a nice man." Constance had been called upon by a nice man within days of their arrival, and Julia was so excited by it all that she could hardly concentrate. "He is a nice man, a very steady man." Ursula set the little tray down on a low table and left the tea brewing for a few moments as she settled down onto one of the armchairs. "And he seems very taken with Constance." "Yes, I thought that too. I think he would fall in love with her at the drop of a hat," Julia said and smiled, her heart buzzing with warmth as she thought of her friend finding such early success and with such a handsome man. "And his farm is a prosperous one, isn't it?" Julia wanted the best of everything for Connie. "Oh yes, it is prosperous enough. He is not an ostentatious man by any stretch of the imagination, but he earns well, and he pays well." Ursula leaned forward and took the lid off the teapot before peering inside. "Another minute, I think," she said and sat back in her seat again. Ursula had been the warmest welcome Julia could possibly have imagined, except for the elderly planter, Ezekiel Meriton. Mr. Meriton was a wealthy man and a very successful tobacco planter who had been in the new colony for more than 12 years. He had greeted the two young English women with kindness and caring, assuring them that they had a home there for as long as they needed and beseeching them to pick carefully and remember that they were the ones who had the final say. In terms of lodgings, Julia was quite certain that she and Connie had fallen well and truly on their feet. Between them, Ezekiel Meriton and his housekeeper, Ursula, made rather fine substitute parents for Julia, and she already felt greatly for them. That was in her nature. Julia cared about people and cared about them quickly. "I wonder if anybody will call upon me at all, Ursula," Julia said, giving voice to a private notion which had begun to ricochet around the walls of her mind. "It is wonderful here, truly, but I am so afraid that I'm a little out of the way and that none of the men of Jamestown would know where to find me." "Everywhere in Jamestown is out of the way, Julia. There is more on the edges than in the middle, so to speak. You'll get used to the place in no time, once you get out and about a little bit. I wonder why nobody has called upon me. I had this silly idea that I would be proposed to the day after I arrived. Are you so keen to be married, my sweet?" Ursula smiled at her indulgently and finally poured the tea. "A beautiful young woman like you can take as much time as she needs." "You're very kind, Ursula. Connie and I have been so lucky to be lodged here with you and Mr. Meriton. Really, we could not be luckier. That heart of yours is bigger than a bucket, Julia. I do believe there's room inside for everybody." Ursula set a cup and saucer down in front of Julia. "You just be sure that you get to know whichever man it is who comes here to claim you in the end. There's really no need for such hasty marriages as take place here when the ship comes in. If a man is worth having, he'll be the sort of man who is prepared to wait, you mark my words. You are very wise, and it is true that I do need a voice of reason on occasion. My brother always teased me about my romantic heart." She faltered as she thought of Edward, his young and handsome face and his eyes filled with tears when they had parted the evening before she left their house for the last time. "You must miss him," Ursula said. "I really do miss him. We hadn't been as close in these last years as we had been as children, but Edward was the one who saved me in the end." "Saved you?" "Well, he got me out of a rather awkward situation. My father had promised me to a man as old as Mr. Meriton and nowhere near as nice. In fact, he was quite a brute. Then your brother did right by you. I probably ought not to say anything, for I would never want my father to know where I am, not now. You may rely on me, my dear. I'm sure that your fears are much bigger than they ought to be, but I understand why you would have them. You are thousands of miles away now, Julia, and it is so many weeks before the next ship is due and that you will likely be married before your father ever had a hope of retrieving you. But I shall say no more about it, for I can see that it unsettles you. We ought really to talk about happier things, more exciting things." There was something about Ursula which Julia found so comforting. She was the sort of woman who could fill in the gaps with certain knowledge. She certainly seemed to understand Julia very well, and, after only a week in America, Julia thought that a very fine skill to have indeed. "I think we have a visitor," Ursula said, and set her cup and saucer down with a clank. "Really?" Julia sat up a little straighter and wondered how on earth Ursula could know they had a visitor when she herself had heard nothing. "I can just about hear hooves on gravel," she laughed. "When you live so far out of the way, you get used to noises drifting across the flatlands." Ursula rose to her feet as if she was now supremely confident that they were, indeed, about to receive a guest. "Should I go and make some more tea?" Julia asked, determined to be helpful throughout her stay at Meriton's 100. No, you must not worry about that. It looks like one man on horseback, she said a little distractedly as she peered out through the sitting room window. Yes, a young man on horseback. He is either here on some business, which means he won't come into the sitting room anyway, or he's here to see you, in which case you ought to be here ready and not in the kitchen making tea. Ursula chuckled wickedly. Goodness, I hadn't even thought that it could be somebody come to see me. By instinct, Julia's hands raised to her hair and she felt all around for any disarrangement. You look beautiful, my dear. Now then, I shall first see who it is and come back to give you fair warning before I show him in. Ursula seemed almost as excited as Julia felt. As that good woman disappeared to greet the visitor at the door, Julia quickly arranged her skirt neatly. She looked down at her dark blue bodice to make sure that it was tidy. It matched the skirt and it was a color she always felt very confident in. It made her pale hair and peachy skin stand out perfectly and she was glad that she had chosen to wear that very outfit, especially if a potential suitor was about to be shown into the drawing room. It is as I thought. Ursula dashed back into the room whispering, her eyes wide with a girlish excitement that was so unexpected in a woman of middling years. It is a potential suitor and a very fine one. You know him? Julia said, also whispering. His name is George Guthrie and he is one of the most successful planters in Jamestown. Almost as successful as Mr. Meryton, I dare say. Oh, my goodness. And he has come to see me? Julia said, her face full of astonishment. You are a very fine young lady, a gentlewoman. Why on earth would he not seek you out? Ursula said and reached out to gently tuck a stray hair behind Julia's ear in a way which reminded her of her own departed mother. It was such a tender moment that it almost brought tears to Julia's eyes. Well, are you ready? Ursula pressed. Yes, I am. Julia gave a little smile of excitement before composing herself. Ursula disappeared again, returning just a moment later with a guest. She brought him right into the room and paused in front of Julia to make the introduction. Julia, my dear, this is Mr. George Guthrie. Ursula began as Julia rose to her feet. And Mr. Guthrie, this is Miss Julia Darnley. Ursula finished with a proud flourish. I'm very pleased to meet you, Miss Darnley, the man said in a deep but gentle voice. And I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Guthrie, Julia said, hardly able to believe that she was looking up into the face of the gloriously handsome man she had first seen down on the wharf in Jamestown. Chapter 7. Ursula took the tea tray away to refresh it and add an extra cup and saucer for George Guthrie. She gave Julia a secretive look as she made her way out of the room, leaving her in no doubt at all that it would be some time before she returned. She really was a treasure, but Julia was already beginning to feel flustered. George was surely the most handsome man she had ever seen in her life and she couldn't stop herself thinking about the day she would marry him. For Julia Darnley was absolutely certain that she would, sooner or later, become George Guthrie's wife. It was just as she had imagined it for day after awful day on the Good Ship Warwick as she had tried to overcome her fears of the ocean. It was the very thing she had dreamed about, just as Connie had advised her, and now it was coming to pass. It took me a little while to find you, Miss Darnley. George was the first to speak. He sat on the armchair opposite and looked at her without any hint of the nerves that she herself was suffering. Find me? Julia said, knowing that she was being a little coy. I saw you down on the wharf on the day the ship came in, and I believe you saw me too. Yes, I did see you, Mr. Guthrie. Julia could feel her excitement building. He had seen her that day and had decided that she was the one woman out of all those who had been rowed ashore that he wanted to marry. Of course, I didn't have your name or any idea where it was you were to be lodged. In the end, I approached John Watterson with your description, but I'm afraid it took him some time to realize that I was talking about you, Miss Darnley. Well, I'm very glad that you were able to find me. It is very nice to see you again. Julia knew her words to be a little forward, but Ursula had assured her more than once that things here in America were very different. Yes, Jamestown was populated largely by English men, and a good deal of the life and manners of England were to be found here. But there were other Europeans too, and even Polish workers, all of them holding artisan trades and something of a more open spirit, which Ursula believed was rubbing off a little on the English. As far as Ursula was concerned, the mixing of cultures was all to the good, and if it meant that she could be a little more forward, Julia was inclined to agree. "Tell me a little bit about yourself, Miss Darnley," he said, surprising her when he did not instinctively return her compliment. "Where in England did you live?" "I'm from London, sir. Kensington, to be precise." "You are well spoken. I believe you have come from a very fine family." "Fine enough, yes," she said, wondering just how much she ought to tell him. "I am from Yorkshire originally," he said, and she was pleased to be hearing a little something of him. "I was a gentleman farmer, inheriting a reasonable estate from my father. When times grew a little difficult in England and I could see no sign of economic improvement, I decided to sell the estate and invest in tobacco planting here in the new colony." "When did you come here, Mr. Guthrie?" "A little more than 7 years ago." "And you came here, alone?" she asked, suddenly wondering if he had been widowed. There was something a little reticent about George Guthrie, and residual guilt for thinking of marrying again after the death of a beloved wife would certainly account for it. "Yes, I came here alone. I began to plant immediately and turned a profit straight away. I plowed every bit of profit back into the planting, and so my parcel of land grew and grew. Within a year, I was able to have my house built, and my plantation has gone from strength to strength." He spoke quite simply, with no hint of pride or arrogance. He was just giving her the facts of his circumstances very plainly. Julia had to admit, she rather admired a man who could tell the story of his successful life without an air of self-satisfaction. It made him intriguing to her, mysterious, and, as a result, even more handsome. "Then it would appear that your hard work has paid off, Mr. Guthrie," Julia said, keen to compliment him but aware that his own plain manner dictated that she ought not to be too effusive. "Hard work usually does, I dare say." He smiled for the first time, breaking his determined seriousness. It made him look a little younger than what she guessed was likely 30 or 31 years, but the smile was short-lived, and he returned to his somewhat unreadable demeanor. "And have you been pleased about your decision to move away from England and make your life here in Virginia?" Julia asked when the conversation seemed to dry up a little. "I have no regrets," he said simply, and shrugged. "Perhaps it is too early to ask you the same question, Miss Darnley." "A little, perhaps. But so far I do not have any regrets either." She smiled at him brightly, hoping to have him see just how impressed she was with him. But George simply nodded, as if taking her words at face value and not lending any meaning to her bright smile. "I wonder if you would care to come out to Lark's Meadow and see the place for yourself?" "Lark's Meadow? It is the name of my house and plantation." "What a wonderful name," Julia said, thinking that a man who had come up with such a pretty name for his home must surely have some romance in his heart. "It was the name of my father's estate." He gave her that brief little smile again, and Julia wondered if he had carried the name on for sentimental reasons, or if he had simply used it because it was easier. "I would be very glad to see your home, Mr. Guthrie. Would tomorrow suit you? I understand, of course, if you are otherwise engaged." "Tomorrow would suit me very well." "Tell me, what occupied you back in England?" he said, changing conversation direction altogether. "I lived in my father's house and gave an eye to his servants predominantly. He did not have a housekeeper, and so I suppose I took on a little of that role. I am bound to say that I did not need to involve myself greatly, for his servants were well established and already knew their duties better than I did. It is still a fine skill to have. Managing people is an art," he said, and Julia chose to accept it as a compliment despite the fact that his countenance did not change at all. "I have a number of servants myself at Lark's Meadow," he added, and Julia was reminded of the list of skills that she had been required to write out before being accepted by the Virginia Company as a maid for Jamestown. Of course, the fact that she had been educated and could claim to be a gentlewoman had been skill enough, apparently. She had, of course, over-elaborated on her role within her father's house, although she was certain that she could quite easily manage a few servants. "Do forgive the wait, Mr. Guthrie," Ursula said as she bustled into the room carrying a tea tray. "But I assure you it will be worth it, for there is a very fine fruit cake to go with your tea." "Thank you, Mrs. Grant." "Yes, thank you, Ursula." "Will you be joining us?" Julia said with a hopeful look. "How kind." Ursula, who had brought enough for 3, looked pleased to be asked. Julia, her rattled nerves making her feel a little tired, knew that she would be grateful for some support. She liked George very much already, her heart so certain that he was the man of her dreams. The fact that he appeared a little reticent and a little reserved was something that she would chalk up to a few nerves of his own. As she looked over at him and smiled once again, Julia was quite determined to see it that way. Chapter 8. Goodness, your land stretches out for miles. "You certainly have worked very hard, Mr. Guthrie," Julia said the following day when George drove her through his land towards his house. He had collected her from Meryton's 100 in a large cart pulled by 2 horses a little after breakfast, and the 2 had driven in near silence all the way to his own plantation some distance away. The journey had taken more than 20 minutes, crossing through the center of Jamestown and out towards the east. Julia had contented herself to look at so many rundown buildings as they drove along, anything to take her mind off the silence as they made their way to Lark's Meadow. "I have little outbuildings all over the plantation to make it easier for me to get out to all of it every day," he said, pointing to just such a building, small and neat, in the distance. "Is there so much to do at this time of year? I mean, it is winter after all. We never stop, Miss Darnley. Even when we have no crop, there is so much ground to be prepared for planting. It is a permanent operation, so to speak," he said as Julia looked across at men in the distance guiding oxen across the land, large metal plows trailing along behind them. It was a cold day, but the sky was clear and a wonderful, wintry pale blue. Having lived in London all her life, Julia appreciated such openness all around her, so much land and so much uninterrupted sky. "The house is just coming into view now," George said, drawing her attention from the land. She could see a white painted house not so very different from Ezekiel Meryton's home. It was large and well constructed in strong-looking timber, and she could see neat green lawns and well-tended shrubbery surrounding it. The gardens and the lawns reminded her of England every bit as much as the fine timber house did not. But if the house had been built of stone, she would have thought herself back home again. "The gardens look beautiful, as does the house. I believe you have a very nice home, Mr. Guthrie," she said as he drew the cart up to a stop by the stables at the side of the house. "Would you care to look inside?" he asked, jumping down and reaching up to help her. He took her hand and steadied her elbow, guiding her down out of the cart. His hand was large and felt warm, and Julia relished in that little moment of touching. She had, of course, been helped out of her father's carriage more times than she could count, but somehow this touch was different. These were the very first touches of the man who would one day, she was sure, be her husband and, as such, she immediately attached a sense of romance to it all, a newness and an excitement. "I would be very pleased to see inside," Julia said and walked at his side to the front of the house, mourning the loss of his hand now that he had released her. The steps up into the house were wide and made of stone and, as she set foot on the first of them, he gently cupped her elbow again as if to guide her. It was unnecessary, but very pleasant, nonetheless. George opened the door, pushing it inward and holding out an arm to indicate that she should go first. It was a simple gesture, a mark of a gentleman, but once again she attached more meaning to it. "Thank you," she said a little shyly. The entrance hall was wide, and the large windows made it a bright and airy space. There were ornate wooden plant stands and little tables with large vases of winter foliage. The furniture looked familiar to her, very English, and she wondered if he had brought it with him from Yorkshire. "There are several reception rooms," he said, leading her into the first of them. "I suppose this one is little used. I tend to bring guests here before dinner and such the like." The room was large and immaculate, with comfortable couches, all finely upholstered, a wide fireplace which was set but not lit, and a sumptuous-looking round oriental rug in a wonderful shade of green. "It is a very fine room, Mr. Guthrie. I shall show you around the rest of the house," he said, and continued to do just that. It really was a large house and George left nothing out. He showed her all the reception rooms, the sitting room that he generally used daily, a small library, a large dining room, and a small breakfast room. He took her upstairs and showed her all the bedrooms, dressing rooms, and even a room with an ornate copper tub for bathing. It struck Julia that it was a very fine home with so much attention to detail that it was a shame that George had lived there alone for so many years. She hoped that he had, at least, garnered a little comfort and satisfaction from such fine surroundings. It was easily as fine as her father's home and, in truth, a good deal larger. "Oh, the view from the window," she said when she was shown into the largest of the bedrooms. There were signs of use and warmth to the room, and she knew immediately that she was standing in George Guthrie's own bedroom. For a moment, it felt wild and exciting. Surely in England she would never have been shown into a man's bedroom. But things were very different here, and Julia was pleased by that. "That's why I sleep in this room. I like to look out over my land," he said, confirming that they were, indeed, in his own bedroom. The fact, however, did not seem to affect him in the way that Julia was affected. Still, he had been alone for so many years that he had likely forgotten a little of life back in England. "I'll take you down now to show you the kitchen and the servant area, and then, whilst we are there, I will ask for some tea to be sent into the sitting room." He gave a brief little smile and Julia felt almost ridiculously pleased to see it. She was starting to realize that George was a man who did not smile too often and was, perhaps, a little serious. But Julia was going to change all that. She was going to bring romance into his life, along with love and joy. He was her mission now, and she was going to work very hard to put a smile on his face. Julia was pleased that George took the trouble to introduce her to his servants when he showed her around the kitchen. He introduced each one by name, and it made her like him all the more. He really was a good man, one who saw his staff as people, not assets. "As I said, I am in want of a housekeeper at the moment, but I dare say we'll soon find one," he said as the two of them made their way back into the sitting room and sat down. "You really do have a very fine home, Mr. Guthrie." "Good enough for you, Miss Darnley?" he asked seriously. "Of course, it is. It is good enough for anybody, Mr. Guthrie," Julia said, suddenly keen to have him know that his personal wealth was not as important to her as he might think. But I would like to assure you that such things are not the most important to me. You would consider marrying me then, Miss Darnley? I am, as you likely perceive, looking for a wife. Yes, I would consider marrying you, Julia said, the words rolling off her tongue with little effort. You seem like a very nice man, and I am keen to make a good marriage, a happy one. I want to give you a little time to think about it, of course, he said as a maid came into the room carrying a tray. Of course, Julia said and nodded, knowing already that she had made her mind up. Thank you. The rest of the morning seemed to pass in a blurry haze as Julia gave into her daydreams and imagined herself and George happy and settled in the very near future. He was such a fine and handsome man. How could she possibly refuse him? Chapter 9. On the day of Constance Dearborn's wedding, Julia, Ursula, and Ezekiel Meryton had all made their way to the church together in Mr. Meryton's cart, all of them fussing over the bride-to-be. Julia had been excited all morning, much more excited than Constance herself, and she could hardly contain that excitement as she threaded some dried flowers through the long curls hanging down her friend's back beneath the pristine white coif. You look beautiful, Connie. Jack Thornton is going to be thrilled, Julia said as Mr. Meryton helped Constance down from the cart. Thank you, Julia. It is all down to you and Ursula, for I would not have put in quite so much effort. Constance laughed. Well, I suppose this is it. Are you nervous? Julia asked as she took her friend's hands in her own. No, not nervous. Resigned, I think. Oh, Connie, but he's such a nice man. I'm afraid that he could be the nicest man in all of Virginia and I still would not be excited. Marriage, for me, is going to be something that I simply have to get used to. I hadn't imagined that my wedding day would be here, like this, you see, Constance whispered. Julia remained silent for a moment as she remembered what little Constance had told her of the man she had been set to marry back in England. The man had let her down dreadfully, but Julia knew that Constance had loved him, and she was certain that love, once it had taken a hold of somebody's heart, did not let go so easily. I'm so sorry, but try to enjoy it just a little, even if only for Jack Thornton's sake. Look, he's waiting nervously outside the church as if worried that you would not come, Julia said and could see Jack pacing back and forth not far from where the rest of the wedding celebrants waited. Oh look, they are all here. Grace and Anne, Diana and Caroline. I really am lucky to have such good friends, aren't I? Connie said and seemed a little tearful. Do you need a moment? Julia asked, casting a furtive glance to where Ursula was dusting a little something from the shoulder of Mr. Meryton's frock coat. No, I'm ready. The little party made their way to join the others, the reunion of the 6 women who had traveled together much more heartfelt and excited than Julia would have given any of them credit for. Still, they had all made such a journey and each and every one of them was trying to navigate the even choppier seas of their new lives in Virginia. It was quite natural that they should be relieved to set eyes on each other again. All 4 women exclaimed over how beautiful Connie looked, and Jack, looking over when he heard the excited chatter of the 6 women, was wide-eyed with admiration. He made his way over to them and Julia wondered why it was he hadn't simply waited inside the church for his new bride to be delivered to him by Ezekiel Meryton, who had kindly offered to give Constance away. She didn't have long to wait for her answer. You look beautiful, Constance, Jack said quietly, drawing Constance away from the crowd just a little and forcing Julia to strain to hear over the chatter of her 4 other friends. Thank you, Constance said sweetly, and Julia smiled to herself. Surely, it would all work out for the best in the end. I would have waited for you in the church, but I wanted to speak to you before we went in, Jack said so quietly that Julia could hardly hear. Oh, Constance replied. I just wanted to ask you if you were sure. I mean, really sure. If you have any second thoughts, I would not make you go through with it, he said, and Julia could not help but look over at the pair quite openly. That is kind of you, Constance said. Yes, I'm sure. Well, now that you are sure, are you ready? He asked in such a kind and considerate way that Julia almost melted. Jack clearly knew that Constance was overawed by the speed of things, and his care of her, even at the potential expense of his own marriage, was just about the most romantic thing that Julia had ever overheard. Eavesdropper. Ursula whispered humorously, and Julia laughed. Did you hear him? Julia whispered back, emotional tears filling her eyes. Yes, I did. Ursula nodded. He really is a very fine man indeed. Constance has done well for herself, you need not worry about her. She'll fall in love with him soon enough, you mark my words. I do hope you're right. Jack looks as if he has fallen in love with Connie already. The little party made their way into the church, finding John Watterson, the official from the Virginia Company, already waiting inside. It was a simple ceremony, the minister seeming to understand that the fact that the two people he was marrying knew very little of each other would make an elaborate service somewhat inappropriate. Once the service was over, Constance and Jack set off for their new life together. Jack had offered his new bride a celebration, but Constance had politely declined. Still, Julia thought that it was nice of Jack to ask, and even nicer of him to understand that his new wife was going to need a little time to get used to things. As pleased as she was for Constance, Julia could not help but feel a little sad when their little party of three climbed back into the cart and headed back to Meryton's 100 without her. It was the first time that the two friends had been parted from the very day that Constance had opened the door of the inn at Gravesend to Julia so many months before. If you're trying to manfully hold back those tears, Miss Darnley, you need not bother on my account. It's bound to be an emotional day for you, saying goodbye to your friend. Mr. Meryton was as fatherly as ever. Oh, thank you, Mr. Meryton, Julia said, and gratefully accepted the handkerchief he offered her as she let her tears fall. It's not as if you'll never see her again, my dear. Ursula, sitting at her side, took her hand and held it tightly. Jack is a good sort, and he would be pleased to welcome you into his home to visit Connie any time you liked. And you'll be married yourself this time next week, Miss Darnley. Perhaps you should throw yourself into your little preparations and take your mind off your sorrow for a while. After all, you're marrying one of Jamestown's finest men, and you have much to be excited about. Ezekiel smiled warmly, and Julia returned that smile through her sniffles and tears. When they finally reached Meryton's 100, Ezekiel made himself scarce in a discreet effort to let his housekeeper comfort their guest. Julia had been glad of it, for she had one or two things on her mind, things that she was ready to discuss with Ursula. Ursula was so wise and kind, so motherly, that Julia was truly grateful for a little time alone with her that day. I wish Connie had agreed to a little celebration, Julia said, knowing that that was not what was truly bothering her. Perhaps she will have a late celebration when she's grown used to it all. She just needs a little time, Julia. Ursula settled Julia down in the sitting room and disappeared for a few minutes to ask one of the maids to bring some tea for them both. Now, why don't you tell me what it is that's troubling you? Ursula said as she settled herself down on the couch next to Julia. I really am looking forward to my wedding next week, Ursula. I know that I have been very fortunate to have a man as fine as George Guthrie propose to me. She began tentatively. Of course, but something is troubling you, nonetheless. I wonder if I ought to have given it a little more time before marrying him. If you're not sure, my dear, you do not have to go through with it. But I really do want to marry him, Ursula, Julia said, and meant it. I just wish that I could be sure that he wanted to marry me." "He asked you, didn't he?" "Julia, I don't think he would have proposed if he didn't want to marry you," Ursula said gently. "I suppose I find his reticence a little disturbing. We've met several times now and talked, and he is the politest man, a real gentleman. But I cannot detect any real affection on his part for me. These marriages happening in Jamestown are happening so fast, my dear, that I think it perhaps takes a little time for everybody's emotions to catch up with them, or even to develop." Ursula patted her hand. "I think you'll likely find that Mr. Guthrie will warm up when you get to know him. He's been a long time on his own, 7 years, and I can tell you that in all that time there has been no woman at all in his life. Like so many other men, of course, for there are not enough women to go around. It's a long time for a man to be without female company, and I dare say it is an adjustment for him as much as it is going to be an adjustment for you. I suppose my little daydreams can't be absolutely exact in every detail," Julia said, smiling ruefully. "And I suppose they aren't really meant to be, especially without a long engagement to get to know one another and let the romance and excitement build." She was beginning to brighten already. "That's the spirit," Ursula said, and gave Julia's hand a rather hard squeeze. "All you young maids are going to need time, every single one of you. But the men are going to need time too, perhaps even more time than the women." "Yes, I can see that now," Julia said, determinedly not thinking about Jack's obvious pleasure in marrying Connie. "But men were all different, weren't they? George was just a little bit more reserved than Jack, Julia was sure. And just because they weren't going to have a long engagement didn't mean that Julia could not do everything in her power to make the beginning of their marriage into what would have ordinarily been their courtship. She could get her slowly built romance after all, it would just differ a little from her dream of a life." And with her new determination firmly set, Julia felt her old excitement returning. Chapter 10. On the morning of her own wedding just a week later, Mr. Meryton had been so kind to her, so fatherly, that he had almost reduced her to tears. Promising her that there would always be a home there for her should she need it, just like any good father would promise, he had provoked a range of emotions within her. How different Mr. Meryton was from her own father. Even though he declared George to be a good man, he still wanted her to know that she was safe and always would be for as long as she lived in Virginia. Her own father, by contrast, had been so keen to marry her off to a man he undoubtedly knew to be a brute, that she could not doubt now that she had made the right decision. And George was a good man, he must be, for everybody said as much. It did not seem as if anybody knew him particularly well, but everybody knew him well enough to know him to be of a very fine character. All Julia had to do now was wait for the romance to come. She would be patient, just as Ursula had advised her to be. But she couldn't help but wonder if that day, the very day of their wedding, would be a turning point, something that would ignite a little passion in that handsome man of hers. She went to great lengths, with the help of Ursula, to look her very best and, wearing a dark pink bodice and matching skirt, she achieved her aim with ease. She had slept with her hair tied up in rags, untying them to find that they had formed the most perfect little ringlets. She used the rest of the dried flowers left over from Connie's wedding, choosing not to wear the white coif over the top as her friend had done, leaving her hair uncovered to display the straw-colored ringlets to best effect. When they arrived at the church, all the same people were standing outside. It gave Julia such comfort to see her friends there ready to celebrate her new life. There was no sign of George, however, and she could do no more than assume that he was already inside the church waiting for her at the altar. He was not going to ask her if she was sure, as Jack had asked his young bride. But then Julia had never given any indication that she was anything other than thrilled by the prospect of marrying him, so there would truly be no need for such concern. She walked down the aisle of the little church on Ezekiel Meriton's arm, looking sideways at him now and again for a glimpse of the comfort and encouragement she knew she would find in his kindly old eyes. When George, waiting for her by the altar just as she had suspected, turned to look at her, he smiled, clearly impressed by the effort she had put in. But as Ezekiel released her and she stood at George's side, he said nothing at all. Perhaps he was just as nervous as she was, although he hid it a little better. The service was almost exactly the same as it had been the week before when Connie had married, although Julia didn't mind a bit. She liked the words, simple as they were, and committed as many of them to memory as possible. She wanted to remember her wedding day for the rest of her life. When the service was over, George turned to her and kissed her on the lips. A murmur of appreciation broke out through the small congregation, and Julia herself felt a jolt of excitement. She had never been kissed by a man before, and she was truly grateful that the first to kiss her was not only her husband, but the most handsome man she had ever seen. He really did look so fine, and it was clear that he had put in almost as much effort as Julia herself. He wore black breeches and a long dress coat with a pale blue waistcoat beneath. As he walked out of the church, her arm in his, he put his tricorn hat on and looked so smart and fine that Julia could have wept with joy. This man was her husband, now and forever. This good man, this respected man, this heartbreakingly handsome man. George thanked everybody kindly outside the church for coming to bear witness to their vows before leading his new wife away to the cart. They hadn't talked of how they would celebrate the day before, and Julia quickly realized that George had made no arrangements whatsoever. Perhaps he had taken Jack and Constance Thornton's example and assumed that Julia would want no fuss at all either. Still, she could not help but feel disappointed, that disappointment manifesting itself in a tight throat which felt as if she were trying to swallow a stone. Just give him time. Ursula whispered hurriedly into her ear before kissing her on the cheek and letting her go so that her new husband might help her up into the cart. Julia could not respond, she couldn't trust her voice to hide her emotions, and simply nodded a secret nod to the woman she was going to miss greatly. "Don't be a stranger to us, Miss Darnley," Ezekiel said, calling up to her brightly. "Or Mrs. Guthrie, I should say." "I won't," Julia said, finding her voice again and smiling at the man who had given her a home for those few short weeks and had earned his place in her heart. "Good luck to the both of you," Ezekiel went on. "And I hope you won't be keeping her all to yourself, George." "There's no need for you to worry, Ezekiel. I won't be keeping my wife a prisoner." George laughed, and Julia stared at him. She realized that she had never seen him laugh before. Perhaps he was pleased to finally be married. Everything was going to be all right, she was sure of it. And, as the cart drew away and she waved back at her friends, Julia thought that it simply had to be. "You look very nice, Julia," George said, using her Christian name for the first time. "Your hair looks very fine." Julia was glad that he had spoken, not only because he had complimented her so nicely, but because she had dreaded a journey made in silence. "Thank you, I did go to some effort and it is kind of you to notice." He nodded at her without another word and smiled before turning his attention back to the road. When they arrived at Lark's Meadow, he helped her down from the cart and they walked arm in arm into the house. He led her into the sitting room before disappearing to ask the maid for some tea. When he returned, Julia was dismayed to see that he wasn't about to sit down and join her. He remained standing, his arms straight at his sides, his palms flat against his thighs. "I'm afraid I have a little business to attend to this afternoon, but I've asked Violet to bring you some tea and cake, something to keep you going until it is time for dinner." "Business?" Julia said, her smile a little brittle as she fought hard to control her disappointment once again. Not only was she to have no celebration for her wedding, but she was not even to spend her first day of married life with her new husband. I'm afraid so. Bookkeepers are rather hard to find here in Jamestown, and the man I had charged with the work simply has too much work already to keep it up. So, I am left with my own accounts to keep, and I am not well practiced in such things, so must keep on top of them, as it were. He smiled a little ruefully, and Julia was absolutely certain that he was perfectly well aware of her disappointment. I do hope that you can forgive me. Yes, of course, Julia said, knowing that she could not yet argue with a man who was, in the end, still a stranger to her. Ah, here comes Violet with your tea and cake, he said, and smiled at her, looking for all the world as if he were relieved. And do make yourself at home, for this is your home now, Julia. His tone became one of genuine care, and Julia found herself more confused than ever. Thank you, George, she said politely, and he bowed his head a little before turning to leave her. The very moment that the maid had finished setting out her tea things and left her alone, Julia gave into the tears of disappointment which had been threatening for so long. Chapter 11. Just 2 weeks later saw Julia falling into a sort of routine, albeit only out of boredom. Every morning, she made her way down into the kitchen to do what she could to help the cook and the maids in the preparation of their breakfast. She was careful not to tread on any toes, and was pleased to find that the staff had taken to her easily, clearly relieved that she was polite and sweet rather than capricious and demanding as so many other women of her class. You do not need to bring the food to the table yourself, Julia, George said on one such morning, smiling at her with an air of gentle confusion. It gives me something to do, Julia said as she took her own seat at the table and smiled up at the maid, Violet, who was pouring her some coffee. I like to be occupied. As you wish. George laughed before turning his attention upon his breakfast. Very little had changed between them in their first 2 weeks of marriage, and Julia had to remind herself daily of Ursula's advice to give George time. But as far as she could see, George did not seem to be at all nervous or awkward in her company. He was himself at all times, as he had always been from their very first meeting. He was still reticent, of course, and she thought it likely that he was generally a man of few words. Still, she would have liked to have felt a little progress, even though he spent so much of his time out of the house on the plantation. George was a hard worker, nobody could accuse him of anything less. How is your breakfast? Julia asked, looking for anything at all to say that would strike up some conversation between them. Very fine, thank you. He looked up and smiled before looking back down at his plate again. George, I wonder if you would care to come back to the house today for something to eat. Your midday meal, I mean. Julia ventured a little nervously. George put his knife and fork down on his plate and raised his head, his blue eyes meeting hers and his face seemingly more handsome as each day passed. That's very kind of you, Julia, but the cook generally packs me something to take with me. You've seen for yourself how vast the plantation is, and it takes quite a piece out of my day to go back and forth. I normally sit down to eat something about midday in one of the outhouses. He smiled at her again, but Julia found very little warmth in it. But thank you kindly for your thought. Not at all, you are my husband after all, Julia said, and regretted the flatness of her tone. But it does seem a little miserable for you to sit alone in one of the outhouses to eat. You must not worry, I am usually not alone, George said and laughed, reclaiming his knife and fork once again. My overseer, David, usually stops at the same time and we eat together. It is a good way to discuss any matters that need attending to in the afternoon. Very well, Julia said and tried to inject a little brightness into her voice. But brightness was a little hard to come by when she felt as if every day was spent trying to find ways to appeal to her own husband. It seemed to Julia that they had no more in common now than they had on that very first day on the wharf when they had stared at one another. Only then, she thought regretfully, there was some excitement in it. Of course, she was beginning to realize now that the excitement had been hers alone. The only time they came together properly as man and wife was at night. From their wedding night, George had proved himself to be both passionate and gentle, and she could hardly reconcile her nights with her days. At first, she had grown to look forward to the night, knowing that she would feel as if she truly had a husband after all. But the fact that the daylight brought with it the inevitable feeling of separateness again was making her look forward to the nights less and less. She was attracted to her husband, she had been from the very first moment she had set eyes on him. But the fact that they seemed only to suit one another physically was making her sadder by the day, even though she knew that it was still too early to think so fatally of her marriage. "Do you have a busy day ahead, George?" she asked, determined to try a little conversation again. "Yes, very busy. Plowing has begun at the very top end of the plantation, and David tells me that one of the outhouses is in need of some repairs. I'll ride out to the outhouse first and inspect it. I dare say that will take up a good part of my morning, for I will need to see what materials we have in stock to mend it." "I hope that your day goes well," Julia said, feeling utterly exasperated. She felt as if she hardly knew any more about him than she had discovered on that day when he had first called upon her at Meryton's 100. He was from Yorkshire, he had sold his farm and estate, and he had lived in Virginia for 7 years. That was it, nothing more. Anything else she had gleaned had been from the endless hours she spent wandering the rooms and corridors of that fine house. She knew a little of his reading habits, finding that they had a great deal in common in terms of literature. Still, she had yet to talk to him about it, never quite knowing when to raise the subject and feeling a little afraid that he wouldn't be at all interested in the conversation anyway, dashing her hopes further still. "Well, I do have quite a day ahead of me," he said, pushing his hastily emptied plate away from him an inch or so before rising to his feet. "I hope you can forgive me for dashing away so soon." "Of course," Julia said, thinking how he always asked her to forgive him for not wanting to be anywhere near her. He pushed his chair back in neatly under the mahogany table and inclined his head, smiling at her a little ruefully as he did so. "I will see you this evening, Julia," he said, and she thought he sounded a little apologetic. Perhaps he was silently apologizing to her for choosing the wrong woman after all. He had made a mistake, perhaps, and realized that he did not want her now. The very thought of it made that awful lump return to Julia's throat. "Yes, I will see you this evening." Julia parroted his words and smiled briefly before looking back down at her plate. She heard his footsteps as he crossed the wooden floor of the dining room and made his way out, but she kept her head down and did not raise it again until she was sure that he had gone. Julia wanted to cry, but she had started so many days in just that fashion that she quietly determined not to do so again. All she could do was absent-mindedly move her food about her plate with her fork as she wondered why on earth he had sought her out, why he had gone to so much trouble to find her after seeing her that day on the wharf. She was beginning to think that it would have been better for them both had he not bothered, for she might have found another man, one who would be pleased to have her, one who would love her after all. Julia set her fork down on her plate, knowing that her appetite had deserted her entirely. There was nothing for it but to give him more time, she knew that. And now that she was married to him, that time could well be endless. All she could do was wait and see, and hope and pray for the love that she had dreamed of her entire life. Chapter 12. "Well, at least we have enough to get the top outhouse fixed, George," David Parkin said as the two of them sat down to open their parcels of food in the outhouse that was almost in the very middle of the plantation. They generally used that one, finding it an easy meeting place for their midday meal and a roundup of the morning's events so far. Yes, I set Joe and Arthur to the task. They're good men, they'll have that building shipshape before the day's out if I know them. George pulled a heavy slice of thickly buttered bread from the paper parcel and took a bite. Shipshape? Or Warwick shape? David said and chuckled. Very good, very clever. George grinned and shook his head slowly from side to side. Honestly, David, your jokes do not improve as the years go by. I know, George, but a fellow has to keep trying, David said and bit noisily into a shining green apple. Talking of the good ship Warwick, how is your own precious cargo? What? George said and turned to look at David in confusion. Your new wife, for heaven's sake. David laughed. Surely, you haven't forgotten about her already. No, I haven't forgotten about her, George said and forced himself to smile. She's settling in slowly but surely, thank you. You will have to come up to the house for dinner one evening and meet her properly. I look forward to it, you're a lucky man and no mistake about it. I reckon you picked a fine lady there, George. A real beauty. Yes, she certainly is that, George said and took a bite of his bread so large that it would prohibit speech for what he hoped would be long enough to change the subject. In the end, he had no need of it, for one of the men had come up to the outhouse to seek out David over an issue with one of the plows. No rest for the wicked, David said and rolled the second of his 2 apples across the table to his friend and employer. Indeed, George said and laughed, snatching at the apple before it rolled clean off the table. For the first time ever, he was relieved to see David walking away. He ordinarily didn't relish the idea of eating alone in the outhouse, staring out across his land, but on that day, it was something of a relief. He could sense that David was going to ask more questions. He was about to let his curiosity run away with itself, and George hardly knew how he would have provided answers that wouldn't have given him away. David was his friend and had been for almost 7 years, and he could certainly see through him as if he were made of glass. George set his bread and butter down, leaned back in his rough wooden chair, and sighed. He slid off one of his long boots, turning it upside down to inspect the sole before pulling it back on again. Idly, George wondered how long he had worked in those boots and thought it must be a good few years. They were so worn that he was certain they wouldn't last much longer, and not even the attention of the Jamestown cobbler was going to be able to rescue them. George knew also, without a doubt, that he was trying to divert himself from his own thoughts. His thoughts these days, of course, centered almost entirely around the young woman who had come to Lark's Meadow to be his wife. How he wished he could get used to her presence, her conversation, her gentle questions. He could see how hard she was trying, and it didn't help, it served only to make him feel guilty. As much as he hated to admit it to himself, George realized that he almost resented her presence at times. Not that the lady herself had done anything at all to elicit such a feeling, but it was there nonetheless. He knew, or at least he hoped, that it was nothing more than so many years of living alone. George hadn't realized until now how he had grown used to the silence, to not speaking at all at meals unless he had guests. He had also not realized just how comforting that silence was, how relaxing in its lack of expectation. George was rough around the edges and he knew it. 7 years alone would do that to a man, he had no doubt, as he had no doubt that he had done everything in his power to be polite and gentlemanly at every turn. Worse still, he knew that he had nurtured the idea of having a wife ever since the ships had begun to travel to Jamestown from England with more than the usual supplies on board. He had seen other men make good matches when the last group of women had come across from England, and he had determined there and then that he wanted the same for himself. For as much as the silence was comforting, and as used to the solitude as he had become, George knew that he was lonely, profoundly lonely. And Julia was a very fine woman, there was no doubting that. She had such a bright way with her, such an open countenance and a tendency towards excitement that was so lacking ordinarily in women of her class. She had taken to his staff well, and he could see already that they liked her. They were pleased with their new mistress. He had chosen well, and he knew it, for there was not another woman who had been rowed ashore that day on the wharf who would have drawn his attention the way she had. Julia was beautiful, just about the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, with her thick flaxen hair, peachy skin, and blue eyes. She had generous curves and such an appealing way about her that he had found himself staring on that day, not even looking away when the young lady had looked back at him. He had known there and then that Julia was the one he would propose to, and no mistake. He remembered well the lengths to which he had gone to track her down, as well as his relief when he discovered that she was not only at Meriden's 100, but that she had not yet been proposed to by one of the other enthusiastic men of the colony. Her being at Meriden's 100 had clearly been to his advantage, for she was just a little out of the way of the hungry eyes of his fellow colonists. If only he could settle to life with her, to open himself up to normal conversation. Even now, as he basked a little in his solitude, George knew that he wanted to be married to Julia. He was glad to be a married man, not only for the relief of their passionate nights. They seemed to connect in the darkness in a way that they did not in the light, and he knew well that that was entirely his own fault. How was it that he had immediately grown used to company in his bed when he could not grow used to company at his dinner table? George stared at the remnants of the bread and butter and felt a great wave of guilt wash over him. He felt shabby for his treatment of her, for his willingness to take her into his arms in the darkness when he found himself disquieted by her company by day. What sort of man did that make him? Surely, not a gentleman. With yet another loud sigh, George wrapped the half-eaten meal with the paper and stowed it away in the small leather saddlebag. Not for the first time, he had berated himself for the man he had become over the last 7 years, the man who was clearly not good enough for so fine a woman as Julia. If only there was something he could do to change it, if only he could be a better man. Chapter 13. Julia had spent the better part of the afternoon and early evening making herself ready for the dance that was to be held in Jamestown that night. She understood that they were not held very frequently, and she had been most determined that she and George would attend. George had been reticent when she had first mentioned it, as she had fully expected him to be, but she had persisted in a way that she was not entirely proud of. George had claimed not to have attended the Jamestown dance before, not really finding any attraction to the pastime. Julia, growing tired of spending her days wandering in that large house and worrying about her marriage, countered with the fact that her friends would be there, and she was keen to seeing them. After that, he had given in without any argument, and she was pleased to note that he didn't seem at all annoyed about it. He didn't seem annoyed, but neither did he seem pleased. He was as unreadable as ever, and Julia even began to wish that she could anger him a little, anything to get an emotional response. Still, as she put on a pale blue bodice and skirt and wound her thick blonde hair into a full pleat at the back of her head and pinned it, Julia decided that she could do no other than be optimistic. It wasn't time to give up yet, for a dance, yes, a simple dance, could change everything. Perhaps it would make a difference to things if he could take her into his arms in the light, to look at his wife as she leaned against him instead of simply reaching for her in the anonymity of darkness. When they finally set off for the center of Jamestown, Julia was pleased to note that George seemed happy enough to be heading out for the evening with her. He looked handsome in dark blue breeches and frock coat, with a smart pale blue waistcoat beneath. He always wore boots, never stockings and shoes, and Julia thought he looked all the more masculine for it. He was smart, but he was not frivolous. She liked that about him, it appealed to her. "Well, here we are," he said, drawing their cart up to a halt amongst so many other carts in the town. As always, George jumped out of the cart and gently helped his wife down. He held out his arm for her to take, and they walked side by side to join the other revelers. The very moment she stepped into the hall, Julia felt her spirits begin to rise. She had stayed at Lark's Meadow for too long, wondering and worrying, trying to think of ways to have her husband see her. It felt good to be away from that now, to be where there was life, laughter, chattering, and music. "Oh, it is wonderful," she said, turning excitedly to George. "Thank you so much for bringing me." "You're welcome, Julia." "It's nice to see you smiling," he said, surprising her somewhat. Had she stopped smiling? "I'll get you something to drink. It looks as if it is only wine or ale. We don't have so many choices here in Jamestown." He smiled at her apologetically. "Just a small cup of ale, please," she said, and returned his smile, hoping that this dance really would change things. "Julia." Suddenly Connie was at her side. "You look wonderful." "Well, I thought I would put the effort in," she said, and involuntarily looked over to where George was collecting them both a drink. "Thank you, Connie. And you look wonderful too. How is everything with Jack?" She was keen to get straight onto the subject of Connie and her marriage rather than talk about herself. More than anything, she did not want her friend to know that her romantic dreams were slowly turning to dust. She had avoided such conversations with Connie, although she knew it would not be long before her dear friend grew suspicious. Oh, but if she told her now, it would somehow make it final, real. "A little better, I think." Constance nodded. "I am perhaps getting used to him, liking him even," she said, and looked so hopeful that Julia realized that her dear friend had turned a corner of her own. "Oh, Connie, I do hope so," she said, and hurriedly kissed her friend's cheek. George returned, and very soon Jack joined them. They made quite a merry party, and, in no time, others appeared, and their number swelled. George introduced Julia to many people she had never met before, friends and acquaintances of his who had been in the colony for some years. It was nice, especially to hear him introduce her as his wife on every occasion. Julia felt as if she belonged a little better, as if there was some hope of her finally settling down into a happier life. As the evening went on, Connie and Julia were parted to some degree, each of them talking to friends of their own husbands. But when Jack took Connie by the arm and led her out onto the dance floor, Julia's attention was immediately drawn. Constance looked surprised that her husband had led her into the dancing, and even more surprised to find that he was a very fine dancer. He was enthusiastic, twirling her this way and glad as she shrieked with laughter, even lifting her off her feet one moment. Julia could see that Constance had relaxed entirely, giving in to the idea that she might finally fall in love with her husband after all. Julia could feel tears of happiness pricking her eyes, knowing that it was all she had ever wanted for the woman who had been her dearest friend. It was all so romantic to see them there, Jack so hopeful and so happy that his wife was enjoying herself. And Connie, looking up at him with wide eyes and her beautiful, smiling face. Julia realized that she was a witness to true love blossoming right before her eyes. "George, could we dance? I would like that so much." She spoke directly into his ear, hoping to be heard over the music and hubbub of conversation. "Dance?" he said, and looked at her a little incredulously. "No, I don't think so. I don't really dance, Julia. Not even just this once." "George, I really would like to," she said, and felt the familiar sense of disappointment waiting patiently in the wings for its opportunity to creep up and engulf her. "To be honest, Julia, I don't think I can even remember how to dance. I was likely never very good at it in the first place." George laughed amiably and shrugged. I don't think you would thank me for taking you up onto the dance floor only to make fools of us both. I really don't mind being made a fool of, George, I just want to enjoy myself. Julia, I'm sure you would mind. No, really, I doubt I would. After all, I have already been made a fool of, have I not? She said and heard the snap of anger in her voice. Have you? George said, his heavy dark eyebrows dipping in confusion. What do you mean? Oh, it doesn't matter, she said, already wishing that she had not spoken at all. It does matter, Julia, he said and reached out to lay a comforting hand on her shoulder. I really would not want you to feel that way. Well, thank you, Julia said, and for the first time didn't sound as if she meant it at all. The truth was that she did not mean it. She was furious with him. She really had begun to feel like a fool, and that night had only served to make it worse. She turned from him, moving away just enough that his hands slid from her shoulder, and she stared blindly out at the dancers, her eyes clouding over with tears just enough to make her fellow revelers nothing more than blurry shapes. Julia knew then that her dream of a life was over. For the second time, her hopes had been trampled on, ground into the dirt beneath somebody else's feet. Perhaps it was time to stop dreaming, for what use was it? Where had it got her so far? And where would it get her in the future? Nowhere, that was where. Julia decided there and then that she would simply congratulate herself for escaping a dreadful life with Bartholomew Exeter and be grateful that her own husband at least did not beat her. He was pleasant, polite, and would undoubtedly one day father her children. She would look forward to that day, for she would find love in a different form and be glad of it. But as for George, Julia was determined now to forget any hope of romance. He was her husband now, for better or worse, and romance was something that was never, ever going to come her way. Well, Julia knew she was not the only woman in the world to suffer such a fate, and, in the end, she would be strong enough to endure it. She would live a contented life, if not a happy one, and be glad of that much at least. I think I want to go, she said, turning back to George when she was sure that the tears which had threatened had now retreated out of sight. I am a little tired. Yes, of course, he said, and she was certain that she could see a little regret in his beautiful blue eyes. But he could regret all he wanted, or not regret, as the case may be. It was of little matter to her now, and his own feelings, if he had any at all, would be his own concern. She knew that they were not the only husband and wife in the world who simply lived side by side, their hearts never entwining. Chapter 14. I've brought some tea and cake for your supper, Mrs. Guthrie, Violet said one evening some weeks later. Oh, that is kind of you, Violet, Julia said, looking up from her book and smiling gratefully. I've brought some for Mr. Guthrie too, Violet said a little uncertainly. It is all right, Violet, just leave it there. He's in his study and I will take it through to him in a minute, Julia said, closing her book and sitting up straight on the couch. Very well, Mrs. Guthrie, Violet said and smiled warmly before retreating from the room. Julia had fallen into the habit of spending her evenings in the sitting room as soon as they had eaten their dinner. She had read more books in the last 2 weeks than she had read in the last 2 years in her determination to keep her thoughts from romance of any kind. She was beginning to show some signs of success in the matter, finding herself better able to disassociate from the warm and passionate nights and treat her husband as a very different person by day, just as he did her. And the less she was a martyr to her own emotions, the stronger and more powerful Julia felt. It was a curious thing, something that she had never experienced before. Her thoughts had been filled with tender romance for as long as she could remember, and she had never truly imagined that she would be able to chase such thoughts away so successfully. But in doing so, she had uncovered a determination in herself that she was pleased to recognize, even a little proud of. She decided to drink her own tea first before taking the tray through to her husband in the study. If he was so engrossed in his accounting books, George would likely let it go cold anyway. Julia liked the idea of testing herself once more, taking the tea into him and setting it down politely without any hint that she was upset by his inattention. Every test she passed, every time she was able to turn away from her disappointment before it had a chance to take a hold of her, was a small victory. Each victory was a step closer to ideas of hurt and disappointment never being able to encroach upon her heart again. It was a state of being that Julia was already looking forward to. When she had finished her own tea, Julia took the tray through the sitting room and along the corridor to his study. She knocked lightly on the door, even though it was not fully closed, and walked in. "Violet has prepared you some supper, George," Julia said, keen to have him know that she had not prepared it herself. Gone were the days of hurrying out to the kitchen every morning to at least have a small hand in the preparation of her husband's breakfast. Instead, she waited until he had gone and joined the maids in clearing the table, enjoying their company. But at least she had made it clear in her own silent way that she was not going to exhaust herself with her efforts any longer. "Oh, thank you," George said, not setting down his quill as he turned in his seat to smile up at her. "Yes, I shall set about that in a minute." "The cake looks very fine," he said, complimenting her as if she had made it herself. "Yes, I've just had a little myself and it most certainly was," she said, matter-of-factly. "I shall just finish this row of figures," he said, immediately turning his attention back to the paper in front of him. Without a word, Julia idly peered over his shoulder, amusing herself by adding all the figures in the column. She watched as he wrote down his final figure and realized immediately that he had made a mistake. Julia did not have to look at the figures again. She knew she was right. She had always had a talent for numbers and arithmetic, and she had every confidence that his own summation was incorrect. "Forgive me, George, but it is 1,237, not 1,221, Julia said in a gentle voice which did not seek to either humiliate or apologize. She was becoming as toneless as her husband. "Is it?" he said, looking up at her and wincing. "I really do not have a head for figures, I'm afraid," he said, and slowly set about adding it all up again. "You're right, it is 1,237. He smiled at her broadly for the first time in weeks. Julia had to steel herself. He really was so handsome when he smiled fully. His teeth were perfect, and when she closed her eyes, she could remember the feel of his lips as they met hers almost every night. How could they be so close and yet so far apart? Julia shook her head as if to shake the memory of their intimacy away from her, determining to concentrate on nothing more than the matter at hand. "You're probably tired, George. I dare say it is not easy to start working on your books after a long day out on the plantation," she said, not angry enough with him to want him to feel diminished by his inability with mental arithmetic. "If I had woken from a full night of refreshing sleep, Julia, I would still have made the same mistake. I am not so proud that I cannot admit it," he said, and smiled at her again, a rarity indeed. "But you are to be commended, for I had not realized that you were so good at arithmetic. I ought to have asked, I dare say. I suppose it is hardly a thing that a husband asks his wife." Julia shrugged. "But it is true, I have always had something of a talent with numbers. I did not pursue it in any way, for I do believe it annoyed my father to some degree. He thought it an unladylike skill and very quickly removed any further training of that nature from my education." "That's a great shame," George said, and looked peculiarly annoyed. If a person has a talent, it should not be dissuaded. Of all the compliments George had given her, Julia thought that this was the most genuine. She had never imagined in all her romantic dreaming that she would ever be pleased to be congratulated by a handsome man for her ability in addition. Still, she was not going to let that take her back to a place of vulnerability, a place where she could so easily be hurt by simple inattention. If you don't mind me offering, George, would be very glad to take over the books for you. I know how you have struggled to find a bookkeeper in the month since you lost your last one, and I would be more than willing to take his place. Would you really? He said, turning in his seat altogether until he was looking at her fully. He had finally put down his quill and reached out for his now cold tea. He nodded in the direction of another chair, a hard wooden chair with a small and inadequate cushion on it. Julia sat down and realized that it was the first time her husband had ever actually requested her company, albeit in a most unusual way. The circumstances could hardly be described as romantic, after all. Yes, I would be glad to, as I said. It would give me something to do, if I'm honest. You need do no more than talk me through your system, and I am confident that I would be able to follow it with ease. I am hardly needed at all to act as housekeeper, even though we have not been able to replace the last, so I truly am in want of an occupation of some kind. Julia realized that she felt a little excited by the prospect of having the responsibility of the accounting for the plantation. In all her life, she would never have imagined being allowed such an opportunity. It would have been so very far removed from her own expectations that it would never have even occurred to her in her old life. If you are absolutely sure, then yes. I would be very grateful, Julia, and that's the truth. I find my attention wanders greatly as I sit here staring down at row upon row of figures, and yet I know that it must be done. All in all, it is a great source of exasperation to me, and I'm tired of being annoyed with myself for having no talent for it. We all have talents for different things, George. For women, of course, their real talents largely go unnoticed. But when you have so much else to occupy your day, I think you do not need to reproach yourself for leaving this little task to somebody else. She had been about to say to your wife, but thought better of it. Not because she thought that his manly pride would take over and he would refuse her the occupation after all, but rather because she didn't want to keep describing herself as his wife. As pleased as she was to have finally hit upon some conversation, some subject, which drew them a little closer together, she was not going to turn her back on her personal determination now. She was going to cling on to her secret desire to let go of all her old hopes and dreams, and she was not going to be fooled by herself into thinking that anything had changed. Then, if you have a little time now, I will gladly show you the books, George said and raised his eyebrows hopefully. Yes, certainly, Julia said and drew her chair a little closer to the desk so that they were sitting side by side. I really am grateful, Julia. He turned to look at her, their faces just inches apart. Not at all, Julia said, briskly and determinedly fixing her eyes on the open accounting book. Chapter 15. You really do look so very happy, Connie. I could not be more pleased that you and Jack have finally found your way to one another. And it was true, Julia could not have been happier. Despite her own determination to turn her back on romance, Julia was not a selfish woman. She had only turned her back on romance for herself, not for all those around her. If others had a chance of excitement and a happy life, it was Julia's greatest wish that they take it, most especially dear Constance. After all this time, I finally realized that everything you said was true. I knew all along that Jack cared for me, from the very beginning. I just never thought that my heart would open to him, but you were sure of it, weren't you? Connie smiled and pushed a plate of small sweet buns across the kitchen table. What do you think? Does my baking pass muster? She chuckled. It most certainly does, Julia said and took a bun. And I knew you would open your heart to Jack one day because your heart is so big. There is room in that heart of yours. I knew so the first day I met you when you took me under your wing and looked after me. Had you not opened the door that day in Gravesend, I might never have walked through it. You just needed time to forget about your old life and your old love. And forgotten it I have. I never think of Russell anymore, not even to despise him. I have no feelings for him whatsoever, nothing. All I can think of now is Jack. Can you believe it? I can indeed believe it, for I have seen you slowly fall in love with your own husband day by day. I really could not be happier for you, Connie. Julia smiled warmly at her friend before taking a bite of the sweet bun. And these really are lovely. You certainly are growing into the skills that you claimed to have before we set off along the River Thames. I really did set some terrible lies down onto paper, my dear, but I think I am slowly redeeming myself. Given that a woman from Kennington in the heart of London can now milk a cow, I should say so, Julia said and took another bite. I, on the other hand, am living up to the simple little list that I wrote. How so? I did not claim to be able to do much before leaving London, and that is exactly what I do. No baking, no cooking of any kind, no domestic work. Nothing. Julia smiled sadly. I think I would have quite liked the chance to learn new things. And do you not think keeping the accounting books for one of the largest plantations in Jamestown is not achievement enough? Constance said and laughed. Really, I would never have suspected you of so masculine a talent. You know that arithmetic is not really masculine, Julia said, defending herself with great amusement. It is only that men pretend to know it better than we do that makes it so. It is only their pride which gives the appearance of masculinity to what is really rather an elegant subject. Have it your own way, Constance said and laughed heartily. But it must make you a little proud. Yes, I suppose it does. Forgive me, Julia, you do not look at all happy about it. Oh, no, you must forgive me. I think I'm just a little tired, that is all, Julia said, knowing that she could not keep the truth from Connie forever. I wish you would tell me, Constance said, as if she'd read her thoughts. You know that you can tell me anything and that I would keep it safe, secret. You know you can trust me. Of course, I know I can trust you, Julia said, regretting any hint that she might have hurt her friend's feelings. It really isn't that. You see, if I say it out loud, to you of all people, then it becomes the truth at last. You are not happy with George, are you? I think it is more the case that George is not happy with me. How can he not be? When he sought you out, looked for you for days, just after one look at you on the wharf. Are you quite sure? Connie said gently. I'm sure, Connie. And I had wondered the same myself so long. Why did he seek me out only to act as if I were encroaching upon his world? Has he said as much? No, truly, George is the model of politeness. He is a gentleman, no hint of malice in him whatsoever. And at times, he even seems to care. But it is as if he regrets it. As if he made a rash decision in deciding to take a wife when it seems likely that he is not the sort of man for whom marriage is appropriate. I truly believe that he is not suited to it at all. Have you talked about it? I know it's a difficult thing, but when I talked to Jack, truly talked to him, everything seemed to improve. There is often so much that is misunderstood when two people do not talk. Believe me, I know that better than anybody. I would not know where to begin. I tried once, Julia said, remembering the humiliation of the Jamestown dance when her own husband had refused to stand up with her. I told him that I felt a fool, but he seemed so confused, and I did not elaborate. I felt even more of a fool then. You are not a fool, Julia. You say that I have a big heart, but there is none in all the world as big as yours. I have never known a kinder and more considerate woman, and surely never one more romantic. I am not romantic anymore, Connie. I feel as if I have had every ounce of romance driven from me. And please, do not look so sad. You must not pity me, Connie, for it does me much good to become a stronger woman than ever I was. You are already a strong woman, my dear. We are all strong women. None but the strongest could have made that terrible voyage of thousands of miles with no real promise of safety at the other end. You do not need to lose the romance in your soul to be strong. That romance is yours, it always has been, and I think you must hold on to it. What use is it when I am already married to a man who will never feel the same way? I have to protect myself from a lifetime of being so in love with a man who will never love me back. I have to let go of it, do you not see? You are in love with him then? Connie asked tentatively. It is all right to admit it. I have been in love with him, I might even still be in love with him, Julia said sadly. But since I have been determined not to be, I can hardly feel anything at all. I wonder if that is simply because you are not allowing your feelings. You are turning your back on them, as it were, but that does not mean that they have gone anywhere. Just ignoring them does not mean that they no longer exist. But do you not see that it would be much easier for me if they did not exist at all? If I could forget my old notions and dreams of a life forever, I would at least have peace of mind, some contentment, if not the true happiness I had sought. Oh, Julia, you deserve happiness more than anybody I know. You deserve that love more than anybody I know. Well, I dare say I will find a different kind of love when I finally have a child. You are with child? Connie said with a hint of excitement. No, but I can only imagine that it is nothing more than a matter of time. My husband is not entirely averse to me, you see. She shrugged and felt her cheeks redden. Then all hope is not lost, Julia, Connie said with a bright smile. It might be nothing more than one side of George's life needing a little time to catch up with the other. There was something so hopeful in the way that Constance spoke that Julia almost let herself be carried along on a wave of optimism. Perhaps Connie was right. Perhaps George had adjusted to one part of life with ease and the other would just take a little work. Julia bit her own tongue just hard enough to bring her back to her senses. How easy it was to feel that attraction for him, that hope and excitement. She had more work to do in becoming a very different person, that much was clear. It was work, however, that she would undertake with relish. Julia Guthrie was a changed woman. She was never going back. Chapter 16. I must admit, George, I do enjoy the spring. Seeing the first of the tobacco seedlings coming along, tiny little things just showing themselves to the world the first time, it cannot be beaten. David Parkin was clearly in a lyrical mood. If you say so, David, George said and laughed. And who knows, maybe you and that beautiful wife of yours will be expecting a little seedling of your own soon. David went on as the two of them rode side by side on horseback to the far side of the plantation. Spring really has got under your skin, hasn't it? For heaven's sake, man, must you always be so cynical? David said, still good-humored despite his criticism. Am I really? George asked, turning to squint at his friend as they rode along. Am I really cynical? Well, perhaps not cynical, but certainly a little jaded. Really, you've married just about the most beautiful woman in all of Jamestown and you hardly ever smile. If I was married to a fine woman like your wife, I would smile in my sleep. Who's to say I do not smile in my sleep? George said, his thoughts inevitably drawn to the wonderful nights that he and Julia shared in near silence. He was beginning to think that he had wandered so far in the wrong direction there would never be any turning back. If only he had allowed his passion to intrude into the daylight, to take his wife into his arms in the morning before he set off for his day on the plantation, or to kiss her passionately when he returned home in the evening. Why had he found it all so difficult? Especially when he was coming to see what fine company she was. As each day had passed, George was beginning to find that he looked forward to returning home at the end of the working day. But as he had become used to Julia's presence, as he had come to enjoy it, she had seemed to retreat. He did not know exactly when it was that Julia had withdrawn from him, but when he looked back, he was certain of it. It was easy to remember how happy and excited she had been in the early days of their marriage, how she had sought to engage him on any subject at all just so that they would converse. But it had been some time since she had asked him a single thing about his life before he had met her, almost as if she no longer cared. And now that he wanted to know more about her, George realized that it would take more than a little courage to ask. His wife had backed away from him and he knew that he only had himself to blame. More than once, George had thought back over the events of their short marriage and had found himself wincing with regret as he came to see himself through her eyes. What sort of husband does not take his wife into his arms at the town dance, especially when that beautiful wife had almost begged him to do so? What sort of a man concentrated hard on the food on his plate instead of listening attentively to his wife, especially after so many years of solitude and loneliness? What sort of a fool behaved as George Guthrie had done? And as much as he could not pinpoint precisely when it was that Julia had turned from him, he could not entirely pinpoint the moment that he had fallen in love with her either. He had spent so long feeling constricted, as if he had signed a contract that he had regretted before the ink had even dried. He had felt stuck in a trap of his own making. The feeling had stayed with him and it had blighted everything else, having him subconsciously ignore everything that was now good in his world. "What's the matter with you, man? You look as miserable as sin," David said, his teasing now ebbing away as his concern took over. "Is something wrong?" "No, no," George said, his instinct to keep his feelings to himself as strong as ever. "Well, perhaps," he said, even that much of an admission making him feel as if he had been pushed backward from a high cliff. "Is it Julia?" David asked, looking a little guilty. "I should not have said anything, I'm sorry." "No, you have nothing to be sorry for," George said, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the back of his horse's head as they rode along. "And it is Julia." "Well, me really, I suppose." "Well, spit it out," David said, his customary boisterousness something of a comfort, lending a certain sense of normality to their conversation. "I'm afraid I rather ignored her when she first came here to Lark's Meadow." "I know," David said, surprising him entirely. "Well, sitting out in the middle of the plantation in a miserable outhouse eating your midday meal when you have a pretty wife at home. I knew there was something not right when you did not leap up onto your horse every day and race back. It was nothing that Julia had done, nothing at all. I suppose I'd just got used to my solitude, even though I'd grown to hate it, you know? I wanted to be married so much that I could hardly wait for the Warwick to come gliding up the James River. I suppose I had not given any thought to how much 7 years of my own company had changed me. I've had my head down all this time working so many hours to stave off the loneliness I was beginning to feel. And then, when I had the opportunity for a better life, I just couldn't take it. And it has made her turn away from me. It's a funny old life we've all lived out here in the colony. We've got used to a world without women, or a world with very few women in it, at any rate. but we'll all adjust to it in time. I might even find a wife of my own the next time a ship comes in from England." David laughed, and it broke the tension. "It's not too late, you know." "Do you not think so?" "No, how can it be? How can it be too late when you have the rest of your life to be married? Even if Julia has turned away from you, as you say, perhaps it would not take too much in the end to have her turn back. And how would you suggest such a thing is to be achieved?" George said, feeling a little hopeful for the first time in weeks. "Well, I suppose you could start again. Go back to the beginning, do all the things now that you wish you'd done when she first arrived. If nothing else, she'll be surprised by it," David said and chuckled long and low. "I wonder what that might be," George said, hoping for more direction still. "For heaven's sake, man, have you no imagination?" David was laughing heartily now. "All right, I will give you the benefit of experience I have almost forgotten. Perhaps you could start with a few flowers? The spring flowers are up, you could pick a few on your way home." "Yes, I could," George said, feeling as if some of the burden of his own character was finally lifting. "I could pick some little snowdrops and crocuses on the way back down to the house." He nodded furiously. "As long as none of the men see me, of course. They'll be too busy getting out of here and going home to be bothered by the master crouching down and picking a few blooms." David was clearly amused by the whole thing. "And then, perhaps, you might find something to talk about. Ask her about her old life, what it was she was really looking for when she came here to Jamestown, even why she left England in the first place. After all, you're her husband now, your wife should be able to tell you the best and the worst of all that came before." "That's an excellent idea," George said, and wondered how he would manage to concentrate for the next 2 hours of work when all he wanted to do now was turn his horse around and get on with it. "I can manage here. I'm the overseer after all, aren't I?" David said, as if he'd read his mind. "Go on, don't waste any more time out here with me when you have a beautiful woman at home to be romancing." David heeled his horse suddenly, racing away from George and leaving him at a standstill in the middle of the plantation. George laughed to himself, feeling the tightness in the skin on his face. Did he really smile so rarely? Was he really so dour? It was a wonder to him now that Julia had ever agreed to marry him at all. He continued to smile as he turned his horse and headed back in the direction of the house, his eyes scouring the rough ground here and there for signs of any little spring flowers he could pick. For the first time since he'd left England all those years before, George felt a flash of excitement for the beginning of a new life. Why on earth had he not felt it a few short months ago when he had first married the beautiful Julia? Still, it was no good dwelling on the mistakes of the past. It was time to look to the future and find a way to make his own wife fall in love with him. Chapter 17. It was still daylight when George returned home and Julia looked up from her book, entirely surprised to see him. "Goodness, is everything all right? You are not hurt, are you?" she said, thinking there could be no other explanation for her husband's sudden and unexpected early appearance. "No, no," he said and smiled at her so brightly that Julia felt a little unnerved. "I just thought it would be nice to come home early for once," he said, and her eyes were drawn to a small bunch of spring flowers he was clutching rather tightly and awkwardly in his large hand. "I'm afraid that dinner won't be ready until the normal time. Cook is making a meat and potato pie, and the last time I looked in the kitchen, she was still rolling out the pastry." "Oh, I wasn't expecting any special treatment," George said and laughed. Julia was certain that there was a curious nervousness to that laugh, and it unsettled her greatly. Was something wrong? Had her serious husband finally lost his reason? "Are you sure that everything is all right, George?" You do not feel unwell? She persisted. I am well, Julia, he said and laughed all the more. Oh, I thought you might like these. He stuck his arm out in front of him so stiffly that Julia almost laughed herself. Flowers, how thoughtful, she said, realizing that this was the first time her husband had ever handed her flowers. They will brighten up the sitting room very nicely. She reached out and took them, feeling the involuntary fluttering in her stomach as their hands brushed against one another. Well, they're not really for the sitting room, they are for you, he went on, and Julia hardly knew how to cope with the sudden turn of events. At that moment, Violet came into the room with a tea tray, another unexpected turn of events. Thank you, Violet, George said as the maid set the tray down and smiled before leaving the room. I thought it might be nice to sit down and have some tea before dinner, he explained, and Julia thought he seemed as awkward as a boy. Goodness, I have not long had some tea. Really, I was not expecting you at all, George. You really are so very early. I hope you do not mind. I have not encroached upon your solitude. Julia could hardly believe what she was hearing. So many times, she had felt as if she was encroaching upon George's solitude that she could hardly imagine he would ever think the same of himself. Why did he care for her solitude? She had been his wife for 3 months now and she found herself unable to trust his mood. George had been nothing but serious and, despite his politeness, had never given her a moment's suspicion that he looked forward to her company at all. Of course, I do not mind, George. I just wish I had known that you would be home early, then I would have finished my work for the day and been ready for you. Julia hoped he could not see the lie. Your work? Yes, I have an hour or 2 left on the books before dinner and was hoping to have it done before you return home. I hope you can forgive me, she said, setting the handful of flowers down onto the tray before turning and hurrying from the room. By the time she reached the study, closing the door behind her, Julia felt breathless and distinctly unwell. For George to appear suddenly with flowers, coming home early to spend time with his wife, was all that she had ever hoped for once. Now that it had come, Julia could not work out her feelings at all. She knew that asking him to forgive her before darting from the room was tinged with a little revenge for all the times that George had done the same thing. She sat down heavily on the chair and leaned her elbows on the desk, breathing hard as if she had run some distance. She did not like her behavior, it was something that she could never have imagined in herself before. And the flowers. How she hoped that they would not be discarded now as she had discarded him. But what else could he expect? That he would just smile at her one day and expect her to forget the hurt and disappointment of the previous months? No, Julia was not going to be fooled again. She didn't want to spend hour after hour wondering if he loved her at all, and after so many weeks of determinedly ignoring her own feelings, she was not yet ready to relinquish her little bit of secret power only to have her husband return to his former self, the flowers and smiles nothing more than a readily forgotten whim. Readily forgotten by him, not her. Julia pulled the open accounting book towards her and stared blindly down at the neat columns of figures. Adding them in her head would perhaps help her to clear her mind. She lifted the quill in readiness, although she did not yet dip it into the open ink pot. Blinking fast, Julia made an attempt to add up the first column, not trusting the result for a moment once she'd reached it. She added the figures again, arriving at a different number altogether. Knowing in her heart that this new figure was not right either, Julia slammed the quill down onto the desk and gave into her tears. She wanted more than anything to dash back out into the sitting room and run into her husband's arms, thanking him for the beautiful flowers and bravely telling him how much she had come to love him. But her imagination showed her his brief smile and the look of apology as he made some excuse to be elsewhere, just as he had done so many times before. Taking a handkerchief from the pocket of her skirt, Julia scrubbed at her face until there was no hint of the few tears she had allowed to fall. She couldn't go back. The old disappointment had been too exhausting, too awkward, too painful. Taking up the quill once again, Julia dipped it into the ink pot as she focused every ounce of her attention on the column of figures once again. This time, when she had her result, she wrote it down confidently in ink and knew, without a doubt, that she did not need to check it again. The urge to run to George had passed. Whatever had caused his sudden attention to her was something that he would have to work out on his own. One thing was for certain, Julia wasn't going to fall into the same trap twice. Chapter 18. The following morning, George took his time over his breakfast. He had been a fool to think that he could solve their problems with nothing more than a smile and a handful of crocuses, and he knew it. But he had spent a long and rather lonely night thinking that there was no way to Julia now, especially since she had already turned away from him in the bed before he had even blown out the candle and climbed in beside her. It was the first time he hadn't reached for her in the darkness, so certain was he that he would be rejected. George had worried until the dawn that he had ruined things forever. She didn't want him now, and he had brought the whole thing to the fore with his sudden change in behavior. But his sensible self had told him confidently that he had expected too much too soon from a young woman who had started their married life with such hope and willingness. By the time he had sat down at the table, revived somewhat by the smell of fried bacon, George had already returned to the hope and determination of the day before. He would not give up, and he knew he would have to find some way to show Julia that he loved her truly, despite all the mistakes he had made. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, the irony of him being the one to hunt for conversation not lost on him for a moment. "Yes, thank you," Julia said, and looked up from her plate just long enough to give him a brief smile. George felt utterly crestfallen and suddenly ashamed. What he felt now was how he had made her feel all along. It was unforgivable, and yet he had to hope that she would one day forgive him, nonetheless. "Do you have plans for today?" He tried again. "I was thinking that I might ride back down at midday and have something to eat here, with you." "Oh, what a shame. I'm afraid Connie is expecting to see me. I had promised to visit her today. I can stay at home, if you wish it." "No, Connie will be wondering what has become of you," he said, feeling more crestfallen still. But he deserved to know how it felt. "Perhaps tomorrow." He smiled brightly, his face feeling unpleasantly tight this time with the effort of it all. "Yes. Tomorrow," Julia said vaguely as she stoically resumed her breakfast. "I am going to find a way to make this right," George said, surprising himself as much as Julia. "I know how I have made you feel all these months. I won't insult you by asking you to forgive me," he went on. "There's no need," Julia said curtly. "There is," George said, staring into her eyes with determination. "I do not blame you for not trusting me now, but I will do everything in my power to change that. Whatever it takes to earn your real forgiveness for not settling into married life from the very first." George could see that Julia was struggling for words. In the end, he rose to his feet and walked around to her side of the table. Without another word, he laid his hand on her shoulder and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the fresh scent of her flaxen hair before silently leaving the room. Chapter 19. For the rest of the day, Julia could not concentrate at all. She really hadn't been due to visit Connie and would tell George she had felt unwell if he ever discovered that she did not go at all. When she had turned down his suggestion of sharing their midday meal, Julia had meant it with all her heart. She had lain awake all night, just as she knew George had, and she had been in no mood to give in to this whim of his to be nice to her. It had felt like a trap. But that had been before he suddenly declared he would make things right between them. Of all the things, she had never expected her husband to open up enough to utter such words. He was so self-contained. His words, not to mention the spontaneous kiss, had affected her greatly, and Julia knew her old romantic heart was not yet gone forever. The day had stretched out ahead of her and seemed to be the longest of all the days she had spent at Lark's Meadow. She just could not settle to anything at all and had, in the end, spent hour after hour in the sitting room staring blindly at a book with not one word read all day. When George returned home at the usual time, Julia hardly knew if she was relieved or disappointed. Had he forgotten his words already? Had he given up so soon? And if he had returned home early, would she have been any more receptive? She doubted it. Her feelings were running in all directions. "Did you have a good afternoon with Constance?" he asked, smiling broadly as he made his way into the sitting room to join her. "In the end I did not go," Julia said, feeling the shame of the lie. "I felt a little unwell. I did not sleep much last night." She looked away from him, unable to deceive him directly to his face. "No, I did not sleep well either." "I am certainly glad to be home," he said, and smiled again before yawning expansively. "At least we are to have a good dinner. Cook tells me that we are having the remains of the meat and potato pie she baked yesterday." "Yes, I enjoyed it," she said, remembering how the pastry, perfect as always, had felt like dust in her mouth. "I will be pleased to have the same thing tonight." How awkward their conversation was, how the openness of his words that morning seemed to stand between them now. If this was how it was to always be, what was the point in trying for either of them? The rest of the evening continued in much the same way, and Julia had found herself a little disappointed that her husband had not made any mention of the subject he had broached that morning at breakfast. He gave no sign that anything was different, as if he had decided out on the plantation that he would not try to make things right between them after all. Should she really have expected anything more? Once again, Julia was guilty of allowing her heart to open just enough to let him in. Would she never learn? She had turned from him again that night, not wanting to feel his touch since she was struggling so hard to separate the intimacy of the darkness with the remoteness of the light. Julia knew that she would have no sleep on account of it, but it was a price she was willing to pay. She would soon have control of her emotions again, and everything would return to its stoic normality. As predicted, she had slept very little, and, when the spring sun began to show itself the following morning, she felt exhausted. She kept her back to George as he climbed out of bed, although she could hear him yawning and knew that he was as exhausted as she was. They had eaten their breakfast in near silence, neither of them seeming to have much of an appetite. In the end, George rose to his feet as he always did and made ready to leave. But before he did, he walked around the table, smiling at her as he did so. Julia looked up at him, wondering if he was simply going to kiss the top of her head again. But he did not kiss her. Instead, he dropped down onto one knee at the side of her chair. "George?" Julia said, wondering what on earth was going on. "Miss Darnley, would you marry me?" he asked, and looked up at her hopefully, his blue eyes wide and expectant. "I beg your pardon," she said, utterly dumbfounded. "Would you marry me?" he repeated and smiled at her. "We are already married," she said, and wondered what fresh pain this was. "And I'm Mrs. Guthrie, not Miss Darnley," she said, wondering if her life would be easier if she still was Miss Darnley. "I want to go back to the beginning, Julia. I want to start again, and all I can do is beg you to give me the opportunity to do just that." "George, I don't understand. The minister is expecting us this afternoon. Will that give you time to get ready?" He was smiling at her ruefully, almost cheekily as a boy might. "What?" "Julia, Yesterday I went into Jamestown and asked the minister who married us if he would be so kind as to marry us for a second time. It is not truly marrying, I suppose, for we are already married, but it is a blessing of our union. Please. Will you meet me at the church at 2 o'clock? I don't know what to say, Julia said, her heart beginning to race. Just say yes. George, still on one knee, laid his hands flat on her thighs and stared into her eyes. I love you, Julia. I know that will be hard for you to believe, given the way I have behaved throughout, but it is true. I have my reasons for being the way I am, but none of them are reason enough not to change. And in any case, would only be changing back into the man I used to be before 7 years of solitude made me hard and cynical. And is that cynicism such an easy thing to let go? So suddenly, do you really think that it will go? It is already gone. It was not so strong that I could not overpower it, my love. And I truly had no idea how affected I was by the years of solitude before I married you, or else I might have admitted it. But then you would not have married me, I suspect, and I would have been the loser by it. I really did want to marry you, Julia, from the very moment I set eyes on you down on the wharf. At least give me this chance to start again, to give you everything that ought to have been yours from the moment you came here. Oh, George, Julia said, her old spirit of romance returning to her with full force. As tough as she had thought herself in the last weeks, her new self was no match for the strength of her old self. Connie had been right, she did not need to relinquish her tender heart in order to be strong. She was strong in any case, whatever happened. I will take that to mean that you will at least think about it. George took hold of her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing the soft skin. I will be waiting for you at the church at 2 o'clock, he said and smiled with such warmth before finally clambering to his feet and leaving the room. Chapter 20. Not 10 minutes after her husband had left to go out onto the plantation, Julia was rifling through all her clothes to find the bodice and skirt that she was originally married in. How romantic it would be to recreate the day in as much detail as possible, albeit she did not want to be reminded of how that day had ended. Today was not a day for such tears, and she knew it. Today was a day for romance, for true love, for her dreams of a life to finally come to fruition. Whilst there was not time to tie her hair up into rags and make ringlets, she brushed it thoroughly and let it hang in lustrous waves down her back. She laced the little dried flowers through her hair, the flowers that she had kept from her wedding day, despite the pain and disappointment. Perhaps she had always known in her heart that this day would come. When she had finished, Julia knew she looked every bit as fine as she had done on her real wedding day. Her real wedding day? Perhaps this was to be her real wedding day, even if it truly only was a blessing of their union by a confused minister. At 1:30, David appeared at the house, declaring that he would drive Julia down into Jamestown if she had a mind to marry her fool of a husband for a second time. Julia had laughed. She liked David and his sense of humor. When they arrived at the little church, there was no sign of George, and Julia guessed that he must be waiting for her inside, just as he had done the first time. There was also no sign of her friends, although she really hadn't expected there to be. After all, George had gone down into Jamestown and spoken to the minister in a hurry. She knew she could not expect that he had visited all her friends too, asking if they would attend the same ceremony for the second time. But it was enough for Julia that George had gone to such effort, more than enough. She knew it could not have been easy for a man as reticent as George to present himself to the minister and explain everything that had not gone well for the two of them in their married life. Harder still to ask the minister to take such an unusual step and seem to marry them again. Apparently, I am to walk you down the aisle, Julia, and give you away. Obviously, I am far too young to be your father, but since there is nobody here to see to it, I will give in to George's whim on this occasion." David chuckled and held his arm out, seeming so out of place in his work clothes as the two of them walked into the church. "Thank you, David. He really means it, you know," he whispered to her as they walked down the aisle together. "He knows what mistakes he's made, and I know him well enough to know that he will never make them again. You can trust me, Julia, I would not lead you wrong." "I know," Julia said, and she really did believe him. David released her arm and she joined George at the altar. He turned to look at her, reaching out to take a strand of her soft hair between his fingers as he stared into her eyes. "You look so beautiful," he said, and Julia was aware of the minister averting his gaze for a moment so that the two might have a little privacy. "And you look just as handsome as you did the first time we were married," Julia said, her heart pounding with excitement. "Even more handsome." "Well, are we ready?" the minister asked, clearly keen to begin. David Parkin drove them back home in the cart, the two of them sitting side by side, holding hands as they had not done on their first wedding day. They were almost silent, but this time it was a comfortable silence, each of them basking in the glow of their newfound love for one another. The minister's words had been very different from the first time, much more fitting, and much more personal. He had talked of love and what a delicate thing it was, growing slowly over time until it was no longer fragile, but strong. Too strong, once it was fully formed, for any hand to break. Julia's eyes had filled with tears and she had blinked furiously throughout the service. But this was where Julia felt most comfortable, with her heart open and her notions of romance thoroughly indulged. And what could be more romantic than two people marrying again simply because they loved each other more now than they did in the beginning? What a clever mind she would have had if she had imagined such a thing in her dream of a life in the first place. Still, Julia had enjoyed the wonderful surprise of it all. George helped her down out of the cart when they reached Lark's Meadow, walking with her hand in hand into the house, David following in their wake. Julia wondered how they would spend the rest of the afternoon. When her husband took her into the drawing room, her eyes flew wide open. For there stood all her friends, each of them dressed for a wedding celebration, with dishes of food set out on a table and smiles on every face. And Wallace and Grace Bates were there, as were Diane Walton and Caroline Lawton. Ezekiel Meriden stood smiling at her with dear Ursula Grant at his side. And, finally, there was Connie, her closest friend in all the world, not even bothering to hide her tears of joy as she stood with her handsome husband. George had done it. He had not only arranged for the minister to marry them again, but he had given Julia the celebration that had been denied her the first time around. "Oh, George, thank you," she said, sniffing loudly. "I love you so much," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "And I love you so much," he said, gently kissing her lips. "Can you ever forgive me?" "You are already forgiven, my love," she said and dabbed her eyes before turning to smile brightly and excitedly at their guests. Epilogue. "Ah, there you are. I should have known that you would be in the study," George said, leaning over Julia and kissing the top of her head as she sat at her desk, quill still in hand. "I have just this minute finished," she said, tipping her head back to look up at him. "The books are made up for another week." She took his hand and he pulled her easily to her feet. "I would look for another bookkeeper, but I truly believe that you are the best in the entire colony." He grinned at her, sliding his arms around her waist and pulling her body into his. "Now, I would not like to give my bookkeeping up, George. I feel as if it is mine now. I am a little possessive of it. Not to mention the fact that I feel that I'm helping you to run this great plantation of yours. Ours, my love. Everything is ours, not mine." Well, I am yours, Julia said and looked at him a little coyly. Ah, but I am yours too, so in that we are even. Yes, we are, and I love you for it. And I love you for being you. I love you for giving me another chance. It has been 3 months, George, and we are happy, aren't we? You do not need to keep berating yourself for the past. It is done, it is gone. We are here now, and we have our whole lives ahead of us. Yes, the two of us are going to be happy forever, he said and held her tightly. I think you mean the 3 of us, Julia said, holding her breath as she waited for his response. Do you mean? Are you? He said, leaning back to look at her, his jaw dangling. Yes, I am with child. You are going to be a father, George. Then let my child be a girl, pray God, for they are far more sensible. Are you happy? I could not be happier. How perfect that our child come along now when we are finally together in every sense. His blue eyes shone with emotion. I could not have put it better myself, George. We are together in every sense, and we always shall be. I love you, Julia. And I love you, George. I always will, she said and stood on tiptoe for the kiss that she knew was coming. Thank you for listening to this installment of A New Love for the Jamestown Brides series by best-selling historical romance author Indiana Wake. Each journey to Jamestown brings new trials, new hope, and new hearts learning how to trust again. If you're ready for the final chapter in this sweeping frontier saga, continue with Open Your Heart to Love, a tender story of guarded emotions, unexpected devotion, and the courage it takes to welcome love when it finally arrives. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new audiobook release.